There are 120 people in the village, and they'll all die before spring. They have enough food for 5 days. Beyond the wall, the frost howls so fiercely that spit freezes in the air. And the guy who couldn't get up off the floor yesterday suddenly pulls a warm roll out of thin air. And he realizes that now he'll feed everyone, no matter who it takes. But that's still a long way off. First, the cold wakes him before the pain does. Dan opens his eyes and sees a ceiling made of bones. The enormous ribs of some beast are bound with straps and smeared with something dark. The wind whistles between them. The air reeks of rancid fat and smoke. His body won't obey him. Every breath shoots through his left side so sharply that spots dance before his eyes. He raises his hand and sees someone else's fingers. Thin, frostbitten, with black grime under the nails. These aren't his hands. Someone is crying quietly nearby. A girl of about 8 is sitting on the floor, holding his wrist with both hands. Her face is gray with hunger. Her eyes are sunken. Her lips are cracked and bleeding. She whispers the same thing over and over. "Brother, don't go. I won't ask for more food anymore." Dan doesn't know who she is. He doesn't know who he is either. But at those words, something inside him snaps with a soft crack. Just like ice cracking on a puddle beneath his foot. A stranger's memory shatters into fragments. His name is Dan. He has no last name because poor people here don't have last names. The village is called Solgir and lies on the edge of the White Forest. 3 days ago, he went into that forest to find something, anything. He came back empty-handed, with a laceration on his side. A beast's fang had sliced between his ribs and, by some miracle, missed anything vital. The neighbors didn't come. No one brought any food. His mother died 2 years ago. His father vanished in the forest last winter. It's just him and the girl, Lena, his sister, and half a sack of frozen turnips in the corner. Dan looks at the sack. Rotten turnips. Enough for 5 days. 7 if he cuts them very thin. And outside the wall, the wind howls, and his spit freezes before it reaches the ground. He closes his eyes. His head feels empty and echoing, like a warehouse after inventory. Warehouse. The word clings to something. Long rows of shelves, freezer rooms with blue lights, the beep of a scanner, -18, an orange jacket, boxes of frozen pizza, an icy ramp. His back slams against the metal. And one last thought, about his mom. Dan Can, 23 years old, junior logistics specialist, Seattle, dead. And now he's in a hut made of whale bones at the edge of a frozen world, and an 8-year-old girl is begging him not to die. Lena falls asleep right on the floor. Her fingers unclench, but even in her sleep, they don't let go of him completely. Her fingertips are blue. Dan sits down. The pain in his side flares up white. He grits his teeth and waits for the double vision to stop. He looks at his hands, tendons beneath the skin, almost no muscle. He can count her ribs on one hand. This body hasn't eaten for days, weeks, maybe months. He looks at his sister's sunken cheeks, at her patched dress, at the holes in her shoes through which her toes stick out, and he realizes one simple thing. If he lies down now and closes his eyes, this girl will die. Not in a month, in a few days, quietly, because she's already forgotten how to ask. And then something clicks in his head, not from the outside, from the inside, as if someone had flipped a switch in a dark hallway. Space unfolds behind the eyelids, vast, empty, a perfectly flat floor, shelves stretching into infinity. The temperature is 0. Blue light, just like in that warehouse. And right in the center, on a shelf, lies half a cinnamon roll. He didn't finish it before he died. It's warm. Steam rises from it. Dan opens his eyes and reaches out, palm up. The roll lands in his palm. Warm, soft, smelling of cinnamon, in a cabin where the temperature is below 0. He laughs quietly so as not to wake Lena. Then he cries, because he understands. He'll feed her, with anything, by anyone. Lena wakes up to the smell. Her nostrils quiver. She lifts her head and finds the roll with her eyes. She doesn't reach for it. She doesn't ask for it. She just looks at it. Dan breaks it in half and holds out a piece to her. She takes it with both hands, takes a bite, chews slowly, picks up every crumb from her lap. Then she looks up at him and says the bun is delicious, that she's never eaten anything so sweet. Dan clenches his teeth until his jaw aches. An 8-year-old child has never tasted a bun before. He stands up. His body protests. The wound burns. His legs tremble. But he stands up and tells Lena to stay in the hut. He'll be back. He'll bring food. Outside, he's met by a blow. Not from a fist, but from the cold. The first breath burns his lungs like boiling water. The wind lashes his face with dry snow like sandpaper. The village of Solgear looks like a graveyard. Low huts made of stone and wood huddle close together. The roofs are buried in snow. Smoke rises from only half the chimneys. The rest of the houses stand dark and lifeless. A wall of frozen earth and bones stretches around the village. Beyond the wall lies a white void stretching to the horizon, and beyond that, a dark strip of forest. Dan looks at it, and the hair on the back of his neck stands on end. The forest looks wrong. Too dark for this much snow. Too quiet. He turns away and walks down the path. His body remembers the way, even if his mind doesn't. His legs carry him past the houses, past the well, frozen solid, past the smokehouse where nothing has been smoked for 2 months. The village is dying. You can see it in every detail. In the boarded up shutters, in the sagging rafters, in the silence. A living village has noise, voices, dogs barking. Here, the dogs were eaten last month. Someone else's memory reports this so matter-of-factly that Dan feels sick. He reaches the edge of the village and turns toward the forest. Not deep into it. Wounded and hungry, he wouldn't last an hour there. But his memory knows something. The old Dan set 3 snares at the edge of the woods. The chance that anything is caught in them is negligible, but there are no other options. The walk takes an hour instead of 20 minutes. He sets his feet down carefully. His breath escapes in a cloud of steam. His fingers go numb after 10 minutes. The first snare is empty. The second has been torn apart. At the third, he freezes. A deer lies in the noose. A young male, 60 kilograms, alive. The noose has caught its hind leg. Its eyes are cloudy. The animal is freezing. Another hour, and it would have been dead. Dan crouches down. He pulls out a knife, blunt and serrated. In his past life, he'd never killed anything bigger than a spider. He places his hand on the deer's neck. He says, "Thank you." He says that Lena will eat tonight, and he slits its throat in one swift motion. It's a messy job. Hot blood floods his hands up to his elbows. He retches into the snow. He stays on his knees for a minute. Then he stands up, wipes his mouth, and gets to work. The logistics expert in him wakes up before the hunter. He doesn't butcher the carcass right there. He closes his eyes and pictures the warehouse. Endless shelves, blue light, shelf number 1. He mentally places the deer there. He opens his eyes. The deer has vanished. Only a bloodstain remains in the snow. His knees are shaking. He sits down right in a snowdrift. He reaches out his hand and thinks of the knife. The knife lands in his palm out of nowhere. He puts it away. It vanishes. He takes it out. It reappears. 5 times in a row. It works every time. He laughs. A hoarse, strange laugh in the deathly silence of the forest. And numbers are already spinning in his head. 60 kilos of carcass, minus the bones and hide, that's 35 kilos of meat. At 300 grams per person per day, that's 115 servings. 57 days for him and Lena. Almost 2 months. He stops, corrects himself. Not just for the 2 of them. There are 120 people in the village. Children, old people. If he keeps it all for himself, he and his sister will survive. But behind the wall, a stranger's child will die. And Lena will hear it. He returns around noon. He has almost no strength left. The wound has reopened, and a dark stain is spreading across his shirt. But he makes it. He sits down next to Lena. He closes his eyes. He takes a piece of venison from the shelf. A kilogram. Warm. Steaming. Lena looks at the meat, then at his empty hands, then back at the meat. She doesn't ask. Hungry children don't ask questions when they see food. She simply holds out her hands. Dan cuts the meat into thin strips. He stokes the fire with the last few kindling sticks. He places the strips on a stone by the fire. The meat sizzles. The smell fills the hut. He gives her a piece, a second, a third. When she stops eating, her stomach is full for the first time. She snuggles up against his side and falls asleep. Dan stares at the fire. A plan forms in his mind. Not a hunting plan, a logistics plan. The next morning, Bjorn comes to the hut. Dan knows he'll come. His memory tells him that Bjorn goes to the weak and tells them one thing. You're a burden. Leave, or give up what you have and lie down in the snow. Bjorn is the village elder, as broad as a doorway. His beard reaches all the way down to his chest. His hands are like shovels. He's one of the few who can still hunt. He walks in without knocking. He looks at Dan, at Lena in the corner, at the empty hearth. He says that Dan is a burden, that he brings in no game, that Lena will be taken to the communal house, and Dan had better go into the forest and not come back without meat. Or not to come back at all. Lena presses herself against the wall. She doesn't cry. She's forgotten how. She just stares at her brother with her huge gray eyes. Dan stands up. He nods. He goes outside. Bjorn follows him and looms over him. He waits for the boy to start begging, or to crawl on his knees. Dan sits down on a log by the door. He's silent for a second. He raises his right hand, palm up. It's empty. He lowers his palm toward the log. And there, on the log, lies a deer. Whole. 60 kilos. Warm. Blood drips from its slit throat. It sizzles on the frozen wood. Steam rises into the icy air. Bjorn takes a step back. His eyes are wide. His mouth is open. His hand twitches toward the knife. People come out of the neighboring houses. Someone spots the deer. Someone sees the steam. A whisper spreads through the village. Dan looks up at the village elder, calmly, without anger, without fear. He says he'll give half to the village. The other half is his and Lena's. And that starting tomorrow, Bjorn will no longer decide who's a burden here. He'll decide how they'll all survive until spring. And Dan will help him. Bjorn is silent. He looks at the deer, at the blood, at the steam, at the boy who couldn't get up off the floor yesterday. He turns and walks away without saying a word. Dan looks at the people around him, about 25 of them, thin, gray, with sunken eyes. The children hide behind their mother's legs and can't take their eyes off the carcass. Dan stands up. He pulls out a knife, and he butchers the reindeer right there on the log, in front of everyone, silently and methodically. He removes the hide in one piece. He sets the liver aside. He cuts the meat into equal pieces. The logistician in him is doing the math. Half the village is 17 kilos, 700 grams each for 25 people. One serving for one day. It's not enough, catastrophically insufficient, but it's a start. He hands out the meat into everyone's hands, personally. A woman with 2 children receives 3 pieces. An old man who can barely stand gets a softer piece. A boy with a wild look in his eyes grabs his piece and runs off without looking back. Dan doesn't keep track of anyone. He doesn't count aloud. He just hands it out. No one says thank you. He doesn't expect it. He picks up the hide. He takes the second half of the carcass. He closes his eyes and sends everything to the warehouse. Shelf A1. 17 kilos of venison. 1 hide. 400 grams of liver. For Lena. He walks into the cabin. Lena is standing in the doorway. Her eyes are wet. She says she saw him, that he gave away half. Dan crouches down in front of her. He pulls a piece of fresh liver out of thin air. It's warm, the best part of the deer. He holds it out to her. He tells her it's hers, that the liver is the most nutritious part, that it will help her grow strong. Lena presses the liver to her chest like a toy. She looks at her brother and says he's strange, that he used to be different. Dan smiles. He says he just finally got some sleep. Lena doesn't believe him, but she starts eating the liver anyway. For the next 3 days, Dan didn't sleep more than 4 hours a day. His body protested. The wound on his side was festering, and every step sent a dull, throbbing pain through him. But in his head, a mechanism was at work that couldn't stop. He was mapping things out. Not on paper, because he didn't have any. In his head. Just as he'd map out the storage area whenever he arrived at a new location. Zone A is the nearby forest, half a kilometer from the village. The forest edge, sparse trees, small game, foxes, hares, partridges. The snares are working. Zone B is the middle forest, a kilometer and a half away. The trees are denser. The snow is deeper. Deer come here to drink from the frozen stream. There are fish under the ice. Zone C is the deep forest, more than 2 kilometers away. Dan hadn't gone there yet. Someone else's memory told him that snow wolves the size of bears roamed there. And something even worse. On the first day, he set 12 new snares in Zone A. He obtained the material for the loops from the tendons of the reindeer he'd butchered yesterday. The tendons were in perfect condition in the storage shed. He stretched them between trees along the trails he'd found by following the tracks. Someone else's memory knew where the foxes roamed. The body remembered, even if the head belonged to someone else. On the second day, he checked the snares. 2 hares, small ones, 1.5 kilograms each. Dan removed them. He butchered them on the spot. He sent them to the warehouse, shelf A2. Hare meat, 3 kilograms, fresh condition. He set the snares again. He went to Zone B. He found a stream. The ice on it was thick, 30 centimeters. It took Dan an hour and a half to chisel a hole with a dull knife. He scraped his hands raw, but he got the hole through. Dark water lay beneath the ice, and shadows moved within it. Fish. Dan didn't know how to fish. The body's former owner didn't know how to either, as far as he could remember. But the logistics specialist had other skills. He knew how to find solutions using whatever was at hand. He carved something like a hook out of a branch, rough and crooked. He sat by the hole and waited. 20 minutes later, he cast his line. He missed. He cast again. He missed. On the 11th try, he hit it. The fish thrashed on the hook, a big one, about 3 kilograms, silvery with a dark back. Dan didn't know what kind of fish it was. He didn't care. Calories are calories. To the warehouse. Shelf A3. Fish. 3 kilograms. Fresh. By the end of the third day, there were 4 hares in his storage area. 1 fox, 3 fish, and the remains of a deer. A total of about 30 kilograms of food. For him and Lena, that was a month and a half if they rationed it carefully. But Dan wasn't planning to ration just for the two of them. He sat down on the floor of the hut on the evening of the third day. Lena was asleep, wrapped in furs. Her belly was full. Her cheeks were starting to turn pink. After 3 days of proper food, the child already looked different. Dan looked at her and thought. He thought like a logistics expert. The task, the village of Solgear. 120 people. The minimum calorie requirement for survival in extreme cold. 2,500 kilocalories per adult per day. Less for children. Less for the elderly. But let's take 2,000 as an average for now. 120 people multiplied by 2,000 equals 240,000 kilocalories per day. Venison provides about 1,500 kilocalories per kilogram. That means the village needs 160 kilograms of meat per day. Every day. Without fail. Dan closed his eyes. 160 kilograms. That's almost 3 reindeer every day. Impossible. No hunter could bag 3 reindeer a day. Not even the best one. But Dan wasn't a hunter. He was a logistics specialist. And logistics specialists take a different approach. On the morning of the 4th day, he went to see Bjorn. The village elder lived in the biggest house in the village. Big meant 2 rooms instead of 1. Bjorn was sitting by the hearth, sharpening his axe. When he saw Dan, he tensed up. After the incident with the reindeer, he looked at the boy as if he were a rabid dog, with wariness and confusion. Dan sat down across from him without being invited. He said he wanted to talk about the village. Bjorn nodded silently. Dan began to explain, not like a supplicant, like a manager at a meeting. He said there were 120 people in the village, that the supplies in the communal warehouse would last a week, maybe 2 weeks if they cut the rations in half, that the hunters had been coming back empty-handed for the past month, because the game had fled the village. That if nothing changed, by the end of Wolf Month, 1/3 of the village would be dead. Bjorn listened. His expression didn't change. He knew all of this. Every single figure. Every fact. He just didn't know what to do about it. Dan said he knew. He suggested 3 things. First, snares. Not 3 like the previous Dan had set up. 30. 50. Set them up in a fan shape throughout Zone A. Check them every day. This requires people, not hunters. Anyone who can walk. Women, teenagers, elderly people who still have the strength. The work is simple. Check the snare, remove the catch if there is one. Set it up again. Second, fish. The stream in Zone B is a resource that the village, for some reason, doesn't use. We need to drill 10 holes. Build proper fish traps. Assign people to stand watch. The fish won't run out until spring if we don't be greedy. Third, a glacier. A real one. With proper ventilation. A 2-meter deep pit lined with stone. The temperature underground is more stable than on the surface. We can store the catch there and it won't spoil. Bjorn listened in silence. When Dan finished, the village elder looked at him for a long time. Then he asked how a boy who, 3 days ago, couldn't even get up off the floor knew all this. Dan replied that it didn't matter. What matters is that he knows, and that he's ready to work. Bjorn was silent for a while longer. Then he asked about the reindeer. That reindeer. Where did it come from? Dan looked him in the eye and told the truth. Part of it. He said he had a gift. Not like the great hunters who can smell blood or see in the dark. A different one. He can store things inside himself. so they don't spoil. Bjorn was silent for a long time. Then he asked where the deer had come from. Dan said from a snare, that he'd caught it the day before, that he couldn't drag it to the village because he was injured, so he'd put it in storage. Bjorn asked which storage place. Dan tapped his temple. Here. Bjorn stood up. He paced around the room. He sat back down. He said it sounded like a curse, like a gift from the creatures of the White Forest. Dan said that a curse doesn't feed people. A curse kills. His gift only preserves. He can't strike with it. He can't kill. Only to preserve what already exists. Bjorn thought for a long time. Dan waited. He didn't rush him. Finally, the village elder said he'd give it a try. Snares and pits. He'd think about the glacier. But if something went wrong, if his gift turned out to be a curse, he'd personally drive Dan out into the forest. Dan nodded. He stood up. At the threshold, he turned around and said he had something else for the village. He conjured 3 hairs out of thin air, fresh, warm. He placed them on the table in front of Bjorn. He said they were for the communal pot. Then he left. Over the next week, Dan slept 3 hours a night. He patrolled Zone A himself every day. He set snares. He checked the old ones. He showed the teenagers how to tie loops from sinew, how to find animal trails by their tracks, how to determine the freshness of a track. Someone else's memory helped. His body remembered. His hands knew what to do even when his mind was confused. He taught 3 boys how to set snares. One of them was named Tim. 13 years old. Quiet. A steely gaze. A bear had killed his father 2 years ago. His mother was sick. Tim came to Dan every morning and walked silently by his side. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't ask questions. He just walked and learned. Dan gave him a separate section with 5 snares. 3 days later, Tim brought back his first fox. He laid it down in front of Dan and smiled for the first time during their entire conversation, just with his eyes. Dan told him he'd done a great job. Then he took a piece of hot meat from the storage and gave it to him. Tim ate standing up, quickly, without taking his eyes off Dan, as if he were afraid Dan would change his mind. Fishing in the stream got going by the 5th day. Bjorn sent 4 people there, 2 women and 2 old men. Dan drilled the holes for them himself and made them better fishing spears. He found suitable branches in the forest, singed the ends over a fire, and sharpened them with a stone. They turned out rough but functional. On the first day, they caught 2 fish. On the second, 4. By the end of the week, the stream was consistently yielding 5 or 6 fish a day, 15 to 20 kilograms. Not much for the village, but it was 15 to 20 kilograms that hadn't been there the day before. Dan collected the fish every evening. He sent some to the communal pot and stored the rest in the warehouse, shelf B1, river fish. He kept track by the piece, memorizing every fish's weight and date, a professional habit. He couldn't do it any other way. The problem arose on the 6th day. An old hunter named Grim came to see Dan that evening. Grim was one of those respected in the village, 50 years old, scars on his face from bear claws. His left arm didn't bend well after a fracture that had healed crookedly. He'd been hunting for 40 years and had brought the village more than anyone else, until last year. Now he brought in very little. The game had disappeared. Grim was getting old. His hands weren't what they used to be. And now here came a boy who, just a week ago, had been written off as dead and who was bringing in more than Grim did in a month. Grim stood in the doorway of his cabin and looked at Dan. He said he'd heard about the gift, that people were saying all sorts of things. Some said a forest spirit had touched Dan. Others said he'd sold his soul to the Silent One. Still others said he was simply stealing from neighboring villages and hiding it. Dan listened in silence. Grim said he wanted to see for himself. Dan looked at him. Then he pulled a piece of venison out of thin air. He placed it on the table. Grim looked at the meat, then at Dan, then back at the meat. He touched it. The meat was warm, fresh, as if the deer had been killed a minute ago. Grim sat down on a bench. He said quietly that in 40 years of hunting, he'd seen 3 gifts of the beast: a sense for blood, night vision, cold skin. But he'd never seen anything like this. Dan said he hadn't seen it either, that he didn't know how it worked. He only knew that it preserves things. Grim asked if Dan could preserve anything. Dan said almost anything, but only what he'd earned honestly or received as a gift. He doesn't take what's stolen. Grim looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. He stood up. He said he'd go with him into the woods tomorrow. He'd show him the trail to Zone B, where the deer come to drink. The real trail. Not the one the old Dan knew. Dan thanked him. Grim took the meat from the table and left. Dan watched him go and thought that he was the first person in the village, besides Lena, who hadn't been afraid. On the 7th day, he went with Grim to Zone B. Grim moved through the forest as if he owned the place, quietly, confidently. He read the tracks in the snow like a text. He showed Dan the deer trail, wide, well-trodden. The deer came here every day to drink from the stream. A herd, 20 deer. Grim said there used to be more of them, that the herd heads north every year and returns in smaller numbers. Something is driving them away, something from the depths of the forest. Dan asked what? Grim paused and said one word, the silent one. Dan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He asked what the silent one was. Grim said that no one knows for sure. Something that lives in the very depths of the white forest. It leaves no tracks. It makes no sound. Hunters who venture too far simply don't come back. No blood, no struggle. They just vanish. Like Dan's father. Grim said this and looked at the boy. Dan didn't say anything, but he remembered. A new shelf appeared in the warehouse of his mind. Not for meat, for information. Shelf I-1. The silent one. Minimal data. Additional collection required. They set a trap on the trail. Not a snare, a pit. Grim showed him how to dig into the frozen ground, pounding with a stick with an iron tip, removing layer by layer. They worked for 4 hours. Dan thought he'd die of exhaustion. The wound on his side burned. His hands were covered in bloody blisters. But they dug the pit, 1 meter deep, 2 meters long. They camouflaged it with branches and snow. Grim said that if they were lucky, a deer would be here tomorrow. If not, the day after tomorrow. Dan nodded. They headed back. Halfway there, Grim stopped. He sniffed the air. He whispered for Dan not to move. Dan froze. Grim stood motionless for half a minute. Then he relaxed and said it was his imagination. Dan asked what he'd imagined. Grim said he thought someone was following them, but there were no tracks, no scent. So it was just his imagination. They kept going. Dan looked back twice. There was no one behind them. Just trees, snow, silence. But the silence felt wrong, too complete, too thick, as if the forest were listening. That evening, a woman came to Dan's cabin, tall, bony. Her white hair was braided into a tight plait that reached her waist. Her face was sharp. Her eyes were light and angry. She walked in without knocking. She looked at Dan. She looked at Lena, who was eating fish by the hearth. She looked at the cabin. She said her name was Solveig, a healer. She'd come to check if he'd been cursed. Dan looked at her. He told her to go ahead and check. Solveig stepped closer. She took his hand. She looked into his pupils. She felt his forehead. She pulled up his shirt and looked at the wound. The wound was red and swollen. Solveig cursed, roughly. Solina flinched. She said the wound had become infected, that in 2 more days he'd have blood poisoning, that he was an idiot. Dan agreed he was an idiot. Solveig took some kind of ointment out of her bag. Dark. It smelled of pine needles and something bitter. She smeared it on the wound. Dan clenched his teeth. It burned so badly that his vision went dark. Solveig bandaged his side with a strip of cloth. Then she sat down across from him and said the wound wasn't from the forest, that a curse smells different, that his gift is real. She doesn't know what kind, but it wasn't from the Silent One. Dan asked how she knew. Solveig said the Silent One doesn't give, the Silent One only takes. Then she paused and said she'd run out of herbs. The pit worked on the second day. Grim came for Dan at dawn. He said one word. There it is. They went to the trail. A deer lay in the pit, a large male, about 80 kilograms. He'd broken his front leg in the fall and was lying on his side, breathing heavily. Dan climbed down into the pit. He slit its throat. This time it was a cleaner cut. His hand wasn't shaking anymore. Grim helped pull the carcass out. They butchered it right there. Grim worked quickly and precisely. Over 40 years, he'd butchered thousands of carcasses. Dan watched and learned. He memorized every movement. How to remove the hide in one piece without damaging the fur. How to separate the ribs from the spine. How to cut out the tendons for the sinews. Grim didn't explain. He just did it. Dan didn't ask for an explanation. He just watched. When the carcass was butchered, Dan sent the meat to the warehouse. Shelf A1. Venison. Restock. 45 kilograms of lean meat. A large hide. 12 kilograms of bones for broth. Antlers. 2 pairs. Grim watched as the meat disappeared into Dan's hands. Every time, he blinked, but he didn't say a word. By the end of the second week, Dan's warehouse held 120 kilograms of meat, 30 kilograms of fish, 12 hides, a bag of frozen lingonberries that he'd found under the snow in Zone A. The lingonberries were small and sour, but fresh. They lay fresh in the warehouse, as if it had just been picked. Every evening, Dan would sit down and count. 150 kilograms of food. For 120 people, if rationed sparingly, that's 10 days. Not much, but the curve was going up. A week ago, it was 0. Now it's 10 days. In a week, it'll be 20. Logistics isn't a miracle. It's accumulation. The village was changing. Slowly, imperceptibly to those on the inside. But Dan could see it. He was used to spotting patterns. At the warehouse in Seattle, it took him 3 days to figure out which employees were working and which were slacking off. It was the same here. People who, a week ago, had been lying in their huts waiting to die began to come out. First, to get meat from the communal pot. Then, just for the sake of it, to stand out in the cold. To talk. One old man fixed the shutter on his window. A woman washed her clothes in melted snow. The boy to whom Dan had given a plot of 5 snares began setting a 6th on his own initiative. Little things. But Dan knew that these little things were the system. When a person stops waiting for death, he starts fixing the shutter. That means he believes in tomorrow. Bjorn started coming to see Dan every evening. He didn't say much. He just sat there. He drank the hot herbal tea that Dan made for Lena. He listened. Dan told him about the glacier, about how to properly store meat in a pit, about ventilation, about how the temperature 2 meters underground remains stable even when it's minus 40 up above. Bjorn listened and nodded. On the 15th day, he said he'd send people to the glacier, 6 men, to dig. Dan almost hugged him. He held back. He just nodded and said thank you. They dug at the glacier for 4 days. The frozen ground was hard to break through. The pickaxes were dull. There were no shovels at all. They dug with sticks with iron tips. Dan worked alongside everyone else. The wound on his side was no longer festering. Solveig's ointment was working, but he had little strength. He ate 600 grams of meat a day. For his size and the workload, he needed twice as much. But he couldn't eat more as long as there were children in the village who were eating less. Logic told him he should eat more because he was the main provider. Something else told him he shouldn't. Dan listened to the latter. On the 3rd day of digging, the first real problem arose. A hunter named Lars came to the pit. Lars was one of the younger ones, 25 years old, sturdy, and cocky. He was one of those who, before the famine, had been considered a good hunter. Now he wasn't hunting. He sat in his hut and ate whatever he was given. Lars stood at the edge of the pit. He looked down at Dan, who was digging waist deep in the ground. He spoke loudly so everyone could hear. He said the boy was cursed. That meat from thin air was a gift from the Silent One. That whoever eats this meat will become cursed themselves. That he'd seen Dan pull things out of thin air and that it was witchcraft. The people stopped. They watched. They waited. Dan climbed out of the pit. He stood in front of Lars. Lars was a head taller and twice as broad. Dan looked up at him and asked if Lars had eaten the reindeer that Dan had brought back that week. Lars fell silent. Dan asked again. Lars looked away and said he had eaten it. Everyone had eaten it. Dan said that was the answer. If the meat was tainted, then Lars was already tainted, and so was everyone who had eaten it. But no one had gotten sick. No one had died. The children who had eaten the meat had turned rosy-cheeked and started running around. Old man Vald, to whom Solveig had brought the liver, got up from his cot for the first time in a month. This wasn't a curse. It was food. Lars stood there in silence. The people around him were silent. Then one of the old men who had been digging in the glacier said that the boy was right. That rot stinks, but this meat smells like meat. Lars spat and walked away. But Dan saw his eyes. It wasn't conviction. It was envy. Envy is more dangerous than fear. Solveig came that evening. She brought a bunch of some kind of herbs. She said they were for the wound. She changed the bandage. Her hands were cold and stiff, but she moved them carefully. It didn't hurt. Dan thanked her. She snorted and said there was no need to thank her, that it was her job. Then she paused and said that Lars wouldn't rest until he found out that he had been engaged to a girl from the neighboring village, and that village was now empty. The girl had gone south, or she died. Lars doesn't know. And because of that, he's angry at the whole world. Dan said he understood. Solveig looked at him strangely and said he was too calm for a 23-year-old. Dan didn't answer. She left. Lena, who had been listening from the corner, said that Solveig comes by often. Dan said she was checking the wound. Lena said the wound only needed to be checked once every 3 days, but Solveig comes every evening. Dan looked at his 8-year-old sister and thought that children notice more than adults do. On the 18th day, the glacier was ready. The pit was 2 meters deep, 3 meters long, and 2 meters wide. The walls were lined with stones gathered from all over the village. Dan made a cover out of planks and animal hides. In one corner, he left a slit for ventilation. He explained why. Air has to circulate, otherwise there will be condensation and mold. People looked at him as if he were crazy. A hole in the roof of the ice house? Why? But they did as he said. Dan moved part of his supplies from his indoor storage into the ice house. Not everything, just part of it. 20 kilograms of venison, 10 kilograms of fish. He laid the hides on the floor as a bedding. He kept the rest with him, a safety stock. A logistics specialist never puts all the goods on the shelf. Some is always kept in the warehouse. He didn't tell Bjorn about this. Bjorn thought the ice cave held the village's entire supply. Dan wanted him to think that. By the 20th day, Dan had stopped counting every kilogram. Not because there were so many supplies left, but because the system had started running on its own. 50 snares in Zone A consistently yielded 2 or 3 hares and 1 fox a day. The stream yielded 15 kilograms of fish. The pit on the reindeer trail yielded a catch every 3 or 4 days. Grim showed them another trail, and they dug a second pit. Dan taught Tim and 2 other boys how to tend the pits, to check them and camouflage them again. Dan stopped going into the forest every day. Now he went every other day. He spent the rest of his time in the village. He calculated. He planned. He drew tables on the wall of the hut with charcoal. Lena looked at the tables and asked what they were. Dan explained. This is shelf A. This is shelf B. This is the supply in person days. Lena asked what a person day was. Dan explained. 1 person day is the amount of food one person needs for 1 day. Lena thought for a moment and said she understood. If they had 100 person days, that meant 1 person could eat for 100 days, or 100 people for 1 day. Dan smiled and said she was right. A week later, Lena was already counting the supplies with him. 8 years old, counting in person days. Seriously, with furrowed brows. Dan looked at her and thought that if he were to do just one thing in his entire life, it would be this girl. Well-fed, counting, alive. On the 22nd day, the merchants arrived. 2 men with a sleigh pulled by a pair of skinny horses. They were coming from the south. They were carrying salt, iron, arrowheads, needles, thread, and herbs. Dried herbs in little bags. Dan saw them from the rampart, and his breath caught in his throat. Herbs. For Solveig. He went over to the merchants. Bjorn was already there. The older merchant was a shrewd man, with shifty eyes. His name was Gunnar. He looked at the village and saw that it was alive. This surprised him. He said that the other villages to the north were deserted, that he'd been walking for 3 weeks, and all the settlements were dead or half dead. Solgeir was the first place where smoke was rising from the chimneys. He asked what they were selling. Bjorn opened his mouth to answer, but Dan beat him to it. He said they had meat, fresh. Gunnar laughed. He said that fresh meat in winter was a fairy tale. Dan pulled a piece of venison from his bosom. It was warm, still steaming. He placed it on the edge of the sled. Gunnar stopped laughing. He touched the meat, sniffed it, bit off a piece, raw, chewed slowly. His eyes grew greedy. He asked how much there was. Dan said there was enough. He asked what Gunnar wanted in exchange for salt and iron, and for the herbs. The haggling lasted 2 hours. Dan haggled like he'd never haggled in his life. In Seattle, he didn't haggle. Prices were on price tags. Here, there were no price tags. There were Gunnar's eyes, darting back and forth and calculating. Dan looked at his goods and did the math. Salt, 5 kilograms of salt is a month's worth of curing for the whole village. Iron. 3 arrowheads meant 3 hunters who could shoot again. Needles and thread meant clothing and snares. Herbs. Yarrow. Willow bark. Some kind of dark-colored powder that smelled like mint. Dan gave Gunnar 15 kilograms of venison and 5 kilograms of fish. Fresh. From the storage. Gunnar couldn't believe the meat was so fresh in the middle of winter. Dan said he stored it well. Gunnar didn't ask any questions. Merchants don't ask where the goods come from. They ask the price. The black moon began on the 26th day after Dan's awakening. The sun, which had already been visible for barely an hour a day, stopped appearing altogether. The sky turned dark gray, then dark blue, then black. 24 hours a day. Darkness. The temperature dropped to a point where Dan stopped counting. In his past life, the coldest it had ever gotten in the warehouse was -25. Here, it was worse. Much worse. Spit froze in the air. Metal burned his skin through his gloves. His breath froze into a crust of ice on his eyebrows and eyelashes. It had become dangerous to leave the hut. Staying inside was dangerous too, but staying was safer. Dan adjusted his routine. Before, he'd go into the woods every day or every other day. Now his trips were short, 2 hours at most. A quick sweep of the nearby snares, a quick check of the pits, back. In the darkness, the woods changed. Not physically, in how they felt. Trees that were just trees during the day became a wall in the dark. Black. Immobile. Sounds that were ordinary during the day, the crunch of snow, the creak of a branch, the howl of the wind, became different in the dark. Closer. More menacing. Dan went into the woods with a torch. The torch burned poorly in the wind. Its light reached only 3 meters. Beyond that was darkness. The snares weren't working as well. The animals were retreating deeper into the forest. Hares were caught less often. Foxes had almost stopped appearing. The snares were triggered once every 5 or 6 days, instead of every 3 or 4. Dan looked at the numbers and saw the curve going down. The stockpile in the warehouse stopped growing. It leveled off. Then it began to slowly decline. He fed the village every day, 120 people, 300 grams of meat per adult, 200 per child, plus fish, plus frozen turnips from old supplies that were almost gone. It was enough to keep them from dying, not enough to live on. People were fed, but barely, on the edge. One bad day and the line would shift. That bad day came on the 30th day. A blizzard. Not an ordinary winter blizzard. A real northern storm. The wind howled so hard that the walls of the huts shook. Snow was piling up in walls. Zero visibility. It was impossible to go outside. Dan sat in the hut with Lena and listened as the wind tried to rip the roof off. The roof creaked. Dan looked at it and did the math. The whale ribs would hold. There was no skin on the roof. It's impossible to fix it until the blizzard ends. So after the blizzard, the first thing to do is the roof. Lena pressed herself against him, not out of fear, but because of the cold. The fire was barely burning. There was little fuel left. Dan took hot broth out of storage every 2 hours. The warm corner of the storage room was working. The broth he cooked that morning was still hot, 60 degrees. Lena drank and warmed herself. Dan drank and counted how much broth was left. 5 liters. Enough for the two of them for 2 days. If the blizzard lasted longer, he'd make a new batch. From what? From the meat in the storage room. But that would require a fire, and there was no fuel. A vicious cycle. The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 days of absolute darkness and howling. On the second day, the fuel ran out. The fire went out. The temperature in the cabin dropped to the point where Dan could see his own breath even in the dark. Lena didn't complain. She wrapped herself in 3 animal skins and lay motionless. Dan lay next to her and held her close. Every hour, he took hot broth from the storage. Lena drank. He drank. The broth warmed them from the inside, but the warmth faded after a minute. Dan kept track of the time. Without a fire and without shelter from the wind that seeped through the cracks in the walls, a person could survive for a day at this temperature, maybe 2. Lena was small. She had less body mass. She would freeze faster. Dan clenched his teeth and began to think. A logistician doesn't panic. A logistician solves problems. The problem? Raise the temperature in the hut without a fire. The solution? He took everything that was hot out of the storage area. The broth, the pieces of meat from the warm corner, and the stone he'd placed in the storage area that morning while it was still hot for Lena. The stone was the size of a head and weighed about 5 kilograms. It was hot, 60 degrees. Dan wrapped it in a rag and placed it under the furs next to Lena. The warmth spread. Lena pressed herself against the stone. She stopped shivering. Dan lay nearby and thought that the warm corner in the storage room wasn't just a convenience, it was a lifesaver. On the third day, the blizzard subsided. Dan stepped out of the hut and saw the village buried in snow up to the rooftops. The trails had vanished. Everything was white and lifeless. He began digging them out. An hour later, Tim and two other boys joined him, then Bjorn, then Grim. They dug out the houses one by one. They found survivors in 3 of the huts. In 2, there were none. An old woman named Helga had died in her sleep. Her husband lay beside her, dead too. They had frozen to death in each other's arms. Dan stood over them and said nothing. Then he closed the door. Bjorn said they would bury them when the ground thawed. Dan nodded. There was only one thought in his head. 2 deaths that could have been avoided. If only they'd had a hot stone, or some broth, or at least something warm. He hadn't made it in time. He hadn't reached them. He hadn't thought ahead. A logistics specialist who hadn't considered all the delivery points. He stood in the snow, clenching his fists so tightly that his fingernails dug into his palms. Then he unclenched them. He went to work. After the blizzard, Dan changed his routine. Every evening before bed, he walked around the village. Every house. He peeked inside. He asked if everything was all right. He left a hot stone for those who had no fuel. He left broth for those with children. It took 2 hours, every evening, without a day off. Lena went with him. She carried stones wrapped in rags, small, serious, with furrowed brows. People opened their doors and saw a boy and a girl standing on the threshold with a hot stone and a bowl of broth. Some cried, some just nodded. One old man refused. He said he didn't need handouts. Dan said it wasn't a handout, that tomorrow this old man would go fix the snares in Zone A and earn his stone. The old man looked at him. Then he took the stone. The next day, he really did go fix the snares. On the 35th day, what Dan had feared happened. Lars. At night, Dan was returning from his rounds. Lena was already home. He was walking alone along the dark path between the huts. His torch was almost out. Lars came around the corner, a knife in his hand. Not for conversation. Dan stopped. He looked at the knife, then at Lars. Lars said that Dan was cursed, that he was poisoning the village, that people were now looking to Dan instead of the real hunters, that this couldn't go on. Dan stood motionless. His heart was pounding. The body of the old Dan remembered fear. His hands were shaking. But his mind was thinking clearly, just like in the warehouse when a drunk loader started swinging a crowbar. Don't run. Don't scream. Talk. Dan said that if Lars hit him, the village wouldn't get any meat tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, or a week from now, because no one but Dan knows how to get the meat out of the storage facility. That Lars wouldn't be killing him. He'd be killing the 120 people who eat every day because Dan goes into the forest. Lars stood there with the knife and said nothing. Dan said one more thing. He said he knew about his girlfriend, about the neighboring village, that he was sorry, that he understood the anger, but the knife wouldn't bring her back, but the meat could save the next one. Lars stood there. The knife trembled in his hand. Then he lowered his arm, turned around, walked off into the darkness. Dan stood there for another minute. Then he sat down right in the snow because his legs wouldn't hold him up. He sat there for a while, got up, walked home. He didn't say anything to Lena. After that night, Dan began to think about defense. Not against the forest, against people. He couldn't be the only point of failure. If he were killed, the cash would be lost. Everything stored there would be lost. 120 people would be left without supplies in the middle of the Black Month. He couldn't let that happen. So he needed a backup plan. A real glacier with real supplies. He began transferring supplies from the inner storage to the glacier, 10 kilograms every day, unnoticed, at night, when no one was watching. By the 40th day, there were 80 kilograms of meat and 40 kilograms of fish in the ice cave. For 120 people, that's 5 days' worth. Not much, but better than nothing. If something happened to him, the village wouldn't die right away. They'd have 5 days to figure something out. On the 42nd day, Grimm brought news. He had gone on a reconnaissance mission to Zone B, alone. Dan had told him not to go. Grimm said, "Hunters don't ask for permission." He came back pale. He sat down by the hearth and was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd found tracks. Not animal tracks, human tracks. A single pair of feet. Barefoot. In the snow at that temperature. The tracks led from deep in the forest toward the village. Straight. No loops, no stops. A straight line. Then the tracks just stopped. They simply ended in the middle of nowhere, as if the person had walked and then vanished. Grimm said it wasn't Tiki. Tiki doesn't leave tracks. This is something else. Dan listened and felt a chill creeping up his spine, not from the cold. Barefoot tracks in the woods at this temperature, a straight line to the village, a person who vanished. Or not a person. He asked Grimm which direction the tracks were heading. Grimm pointed. Dan followed the direction. The tracks led straight to Solgear, to the center of the village, to his hut. Grimm looked at him and said he knew what Dan was thinking. He said that Dan's father had gone into the woods a year ago, that no one had found his body, that the footprint size matched. Dan sat motionless. A single thought pulsed in his head. His father, or what used to be his father. He's heading toward the village. He's heading toward him. Why? Dan hadn't slept for 3 nights after what Grimm had told him. During the day, he worked as usual. He checked the snares, he counted the supplies, he patrolled the village in the evening. He handed out stones and broth. At night, he lay there and listened to the silence beyond the walls, the wind, the creaking of wood. And he waited. Waited for footsteps. Barefoot footsteps in the snow. They didn't come. On the 4th night, he fell asleep from exhaustion while sitting right by the hearth. Lena covered him with a pelt and lay down beside him. In the morning, he woke up and realized that nothing had happened. There had been tracks. The tracks had vanished. Maybe whoever was coming had turned back. Maybe they disappeared for good. Dan decided not to think about it until he had new information. A logistician works with facts. Fact 1, tracks. Fact 2, the tracks end. The rest is speculation. Speculation doesn't put food on the table. On the 45th day, a woman arrived in the village, alone, on foot, without a sled, without any belongings, wearing only a fur-lined jacket and carrying a knife on her belt. Petite, lean, a face covered in freckles. One eye was light gray, the other was almost black. She emerged from the forest at dawn, which didn't exist because it was the black moon and there are no dawns. She emerged from the darkness. The sentry on the rampart saw her and shouted. Bjorn came out. Dan came out. The woman stood by the rampart and looked at them, silently. Then she said one word. Food. Bjorn asked who she was. She said her name was Era, that she was from Hravna, that she was a tracker, that she'd been cast out, that she'd been walking for 4 days, that she didn't have the strength to say more. Dan looked at her chapped lips, at her frostbitten fingers, at her eyes, one gray, one black. He took a bowl of hot broth from the storeroom and handed it to her. Era took it with both hands. She drank for a long time, her lips never leaving the rim of the bowl. When she finished, she looked at Dan. then at his empty hands, from which he had just produced a full bowl. Then back at Dan. She said nothing. She just nodded. They laid Aira in the hut next to Solvay's. Solvay examined her. Second-degree frostbite on her toes, exhaustion, dehydration, scrapes and cuts all over her body. The girl had been walking through the forest for 4 days without food. Solvay cursed under her breath. She applied ointment to her toes. She bandaged the wounds. Dan brought meat and fish. He said to feed her often and in small amounts, that after starvation, you can't give her a lot all at once. Her stomach wouldn't be able to handle it. Solvay looked at him and asked how he knew that. Dan said he just knew. Solvay snorted, but did as he said. Aira came to her senses 2 days later. On the 3rd day, she got up. On the 4th, she stepped out of the hut. She moved quietly, almost silently. Dan noticed it right away. He was standing by the glacier counting their supplies when he sensed someone behind him. He turned around. Aira, half a meter away. He hadn't heard a single step. She stood there, looking at him. Then she said she wanted to talk. Dan nodded. They sat down by his hut. Lena brought some hot broth. Aira took the mug but didn't drink. She held it in her hands, warming her fingers. She began to speak, quietly, slowly, choosing her words like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. She had been a tracker in the Northern Hunters Guild in Hravna. Not just any tracker, the best. Her gift had appeared when she was 12. She could sense blood from a verst away. She saw tracks that others missed. She could hear a beast's breath through 2 layers of snow. The guild took her in as a child. They trained her. They used her. She found the beasts. The hunters killed them. They divided the spoils. She got the smallest share because she didn't kill. She only found them. A year ago, she found something else. Not a beast, a hiding place. The guild's senior hunter had been stashing part of the shared spoils for himself. Hides, meat, salt. A lot. Enough for several months, while the other hunters and their families were receiving reduced rations. Aira spoke up about it at the General Assembly. The senior hunter denied it. The guild leader, named Hraven Ingvarsson, sided with his man. Aira was branded a liar. She was expelled. Without supplies, without weapons, with just a knife, in the middle of winter. She walked through the forest for 4 days. She ate bark. She slept buried in the snow like an animal. She headed west because she'd heard from merchants that there was a living village to the west, Solgear. She came here because she had nowhere else to go. Dan listened in silence. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he asked one thing. Why had she told the truth? She could have kept quiet. The hidden hides weren't her business. Why take the risk? Aira looked at him. Her eyes were different. One was cold and gray. The other was hot and black. She said she couldn't keep quiet when she saw something, that it was like blood. If she smelled blood, she couldn't pretend she didn't. If she saw a lie, she couldn't pretend she didn't. Dan nodded. He said she could stay in Solgear, that they'd give her a hut, food, work. Aira asked what kind of work. Dan said hunting, that he needed a tracker, that his own instinct for the forest was just the faint memory of a weak hunter. And she needed a hunter who could carry the kill. She searches, he brings it back. Together, they'll cover twice as much territory. Aira was silent. Then she nodded, briefly, with a single nod. Dan held out his hand to her. She looked at his hand. Then she shook it. Her hand was small and stiff. Her grip was like that of a tick. Their first hunt together took place the next day. Dan and Aira set out for Zone B at dawn. Aira walked ahead, quietly, like a shadow. Dan followed her, trying not to make a sound. He wasn't very good at it. Every step he took crunched in the snow. Era turned around and looked at him with an expression he interpreted as patient suffering. An hour later, she stopped. She raised her hand. Dan froze. Era stood motionless. Then she turned her head to the left. She pointed. Dan looked. Nothing. White snow, gray trees, silence. Era walked to the left. 200 meters away, Dan saw them. Tracks. Fresh. Deep. A moose. A large one. It had passed by recently. Era crouched down and touched the track. She pointed in the direction. They followed the trail. Half an hour later, Ira stopped again. She pointed ahead. Dan squinted. A moose stood among the trees. A large male. Its antlers were branched. It stood with its side to them, chewing bark from a tree. It hadn't sensed them. The wind blew in their faces. Ira looked at Dan. Dan looked at the deer. He didn't have a bow. He didn't have a spear. He had a knife. Useless at that distance. 20 meters. He looked at Ira. She looked at him too. Then she pulled a short bow from behind her back. Dan hadn't seen it before. She'd been carrying it under her jacket. One arrow. Just one. Apparently all she had left. Ira drew the bow. In one smooth motion, she took aim. She shot. The arrow entered the deer's neck behind its ear. It collapsed without making a sound. A clean shot, right into a nerve center. Instant death. Dan stood and watched. Then he looked at Ira. She lowered her bow. Her expression didn't change. No joy, no pride, nothing. Just business. Dan walked over to the deer. He crouched down. He thanked the deer. Then he looked at Ira and thanked her. He said that without her, he would have been stuck here for 3 days. Ira blinked. Once. Quickly. Then she turned away. Dan could have sworn he saw her ears turn red. They butchered the deer together. Ira handled the knife just as well as Grim. Quickly, precisely. Dan sent the meat to the storage shed. Ira watched as a piece of meat vanished from his hands. She watched closely. She wasn't scared. She didn't flinch. She just watched. Then she asked quietly where it was going. Dan said to the warehouse. Ira asked which warehouse. Dan tapped his temple. Ira nodded silently and continued butchering. As if a man hiding meat inside his own head were the most ordinary thing in the world. Dan thought he liked this woman. Not like that, in a friendly way. The way you like someone who doesn't ask unnecessary questions and just gets the job done. On the way back, Ira stopped, abruptly. She raised her hand. Dan froze. Ira stood motionless. Her nostrils flared. Her eyes were half closed. She sensed something. Dan waited. A minute. 2. Then Ira turned to him and whispered that someone was following them. Dan felt his heart skip a beat. He asked who. Ira shook her head. She said she didn't know. No smell of blood, no smell of sweat, no smell of a beast. But she could sense it. Something was following them, from a distance, not getting closer, just following. Dan thought of Grim, barefoot tracks, a straight line to the village. He asked Ira if she could estimate the distance. Ira closed her eyes. She stood like that for half a minute. Then she opened them and said it was far away, 300 meters, maybe more. It's standing still, not moving, just standing there and watching. Dan looked in the direction she'd pointed. Trees, snow, the darkness of the black moon. Nothing. But the feeling was there, a heavy one, like pressure on the back of his head, like a gaze from a dark corridor. Dan said, "Let's go." They headed toward the village, quickly, without looking back. Ira walked behind them, covering their backs, her hand on her knife. When they emerged from the forest into the open space in front of the village rampart, Ira stopped. She turned around. She stood there for a moment. Then she said it was gone. The thing that had been at the edge of the woods, it had been standing among the trees, and it had left when they came out into the open. Dan asked if it was afraid of open spaces. Ira said she didn't know. Maybe it was afraid. Maybe it just didn't want to be seen. That evening, Dan sat in the cabin and thought. Lena was asleep. It was quiet, peaceful. His stomach was full. Dan looked at her and thought he had to figure out what was in the forest. Not tomorrow, not in a month, but he had to, because it wasn't going away. It was getting closer. Slowly, but it was getting closer. And if it reached the village, everything he'd built over the past month and a half wouldn't matter. Snares, the glacier, supplies, all of this is nothing if something emerges from the forest that can't be kept out by a wall. He closed his eyes and opened his storeroom. He looked at the shelves. 250 kilograms of meat, 80 kilograms of fish, salt, hides, herbs, hot stones, broth, and on a separate shelf, half a cinnamon roll. Warm, smelling of a home that no longer exists. Dan looked at it and thought that if his mother was waiting for him in that other world, he would never arrive. That she was standing at the door, waiting, and there was nothing he could do. But here, in this world, there's a girl who isn't hungry anymore. There's a village that isn't dying anymore. There's a herbalist who has herbs again. There's a tracker who ate a hot meal for the first time in a year. And there's something in the forest coming toward them, and he has to protect them from it. How? He didn't know, but he'll find out. The next day, Dan was cooking dinner, a separate meal for Ira. He remembered how she'd eaten lingonberries from a bowl while patrolling the village, how she'd picked out the sour ones, how her face would change when she ate something sour, barely noticeable, almost imperceptible, but Dan had noticed. He put a handful of frozen lingonberries in her portion. Sour, small, the kind he'd found under the snow in Zone A. They'd stayed fresh in storage, red, bright. He brought the bowl to her cabin. He knocked. Ira opened the door. Dan held out the bowl. Venison with lingonberries. Hot, steaming. Ira took it. She looked at the meat, then at the berries, then at Dan. She didn't say anything. She closed the door. Dan left. He didn't see her eating. He didn't see her picking the lingonberries out of the bowl and eating each berry one by one, slowly, with her eyes closed. He didn't see her sitting on the floor afterward, pressing the empty bowl to her chest. He didn't see it, but he knew. Because Dan didn't just feed people in general. He fed each and every one of them. The light returned on the 56th day. Not the sun, a streak of gray on the horizon. Dull, barely noticeable. But after a month of absolute darkness, even that streak seemed like a miracle. People came out of their huts and stood facing south, silently. They watched. Some were crying. Others simply stood with their eyes closed, turning their faces toward the faint light. Dan stood among them and counted. 56 days. 8 weeks. During that time, he had lost 2 people, Helga and her husband. 118 people out of 120 are alive. 98%. At the warehouse in Seattle, he'd lost a higher percentage of inventory in 8 weeks. He thought about that and felt disgusted with himself. People aren't merchandise. Helga isn't an inventory item. He rubbed his face and went to work. With the return of daylight, the forest had changed. The animals had become more active. The snares in Zone A were working at full capacity. 4 or 5 hares a day, a fox every other day. The pits in Zone B yielded a deer every 2 or 3 days. Era led Dan deeper and deeper to the edge of Zone B. There she found tracks he would never have seen on his own. A scratch on the bark, a tuft of fur on a branch, a dent in the snow that was already 3 days old, but Era read it as if it were fresh. With her, he bagged as much in a week as he had without her in 3. The stockpile was growing. 300 kilograms of meat, 120 fish. Dan did the math and realized that things were finally starting to turn around for real. Era hunted in silence. She spoke very little, 5 or 6 words the entire time they were out. Go. Stop. Quiet. Over there. Deer. Done. Dan was used to it. He didn't need words. He was used to working with partners who did their job without making a fuss. At the warehouse, the best loaders were just like that. Quiet, precise, reliable. Era was the best loader he'd ever met. Only instead of boxes, she hauled reindeer, and instead of a scanner, she used her nose. On the 60th day, Dan prepared a communal dinner for the first time. Not in the cabin, outdoors. By the communal hearth that Bjorn had ordered to be built in the center of the village even before the black moon, but which no one had used because there was no food. Dan built a fire. He hung a cauldron over it. The cauldron was old and full of holes, and Grim had patched it up with an iron patch. Dan took 20 kilograms of reindeer meat out of the storeroom. Frozen lingonberries, wild onions he'd found under the snow by the stream, salt. He threw everything into the cauldron. He filled it with water. The smell spread through the village within 10 minutes. People began to come out, first one by one, then in families, then everyone. 118 people stood around the pot and watched the thick, bubbling stew. Dan served it out to everyone, personally, bowl by bowl. The children first, then the women, then the elderly, then the men, himself last. He stood by the cauldron with a ladle and watched their faces. The boy Tim ate and couldn't stop. Old man Vald, whom Solveig had brought back from the brink of death, sat on a bench and chewed slowly. His eyes were wet. Bjorn stood off to the side and ate in silence. He looked at Dan over the rim of his bowl. His face was inscrutable. But he ate. And 10 minutes later, he came back for seconds. Dan gave it to him without a word. Solveig was the last to approach. She took a bowl. She stood next to Dan and ate. Then she said quietly that Wald was getting better, that the yarrow was working, that she now had enough herbs to treat 6 people at once. Before, she'd only had enough for 1. Dan nodded. Solveig paused and said one more thing. That she'd had a brother, a younger one. His name was Thomas. 2 years ago, he caught a cold, an ordinary cold, a cough, a fever. Solveig didn't have any herbs. She'd run out. She had nothing to trade for more. She treated him with whatever she had. Hot water, prayer, her hands. It didn't help. Thomas died the night before dawn. He was 11 years old. Solveig told this in an even voice, without pauses, without tears, like a report. Dan listened and didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said that Thomas wouldn't freeze anymore. Solveig looked at him sharply. Dan said he knew Thomas couldn't be brought back, but the next child who fell ill in Solgear would receive yarrow and willow bark and hot broth. Every single one. Always. He said it wasn't for Thomas's memory. It was for the next Thomas. Solveig stood there and looked at him. Then she turned away and left, quickly, without looking back. Lena, who was standing nearby, said that Solveig was crying again. Dan said he knew. Lena said they were good tears. Dan nodded. On the 65th day, neighbors arrived. Not traders. The village elder from Craigholm, 2 days' journey to the north. His name was Olaf. Old. Withered. He was accompanied by 2 hunters. They could barely stand on their feet. Olaf entered the village and saw smoke rising from the chimneys. He saw people in the streets. He saw children, alive, running. He fell to his knees right by the rampart. Bjorn approached him. Olaf said that Kraugholm was dying, that they had 30 people left out of 70, that there was no food, that they had come to ask, not to trade, to ask for help. Bjorn looked at Dan. Dan walked over. He crouched down in front of Olaf. He asked how many children there were in his village. Olaf said 9. Dan closed his eyes. He did the math. 30 people. At a minimum of 300 grams of meat per day, 9 kilograms. 270 kilograms a month. He had 350 in his warehouse. If he gave away 270, he'd have 80 left. That wasn't enough for his village. Not nearly enough. But the system worked. Snares, pits, the stream, Ada. He'd make up the difference in a month. If nothing bad happened. If. Dan opened his eyes. He told Olaf to send some men with a sled, that he'd give them meat, as much as he could. Olaf looked up at him. The old man's eyes were wet. He tried to grab Dan's hands. Dan pulled away. He said there was no need, that this wasn't charity, that he'd ask for something in return. Olaf nodded. Anything. Dan said he needed people. 2 or 3 strong men who would come to Solgir and work. Dig holes, set snares, chop wood for firewood. Not forever, for a month. Then they'd go back home and teach others to do the same. Olaf nodded. He said he'd send the 3 best. Dan said not the best, the hungriest. Those who are hungry work harder. Olaf blinked. Then he understood and nodded. 3 days later, a sleigh arrived from Kraugholm. 2 men and 1 woman, skinny, gray, with eyes that were empty. Dan laid out the meat for them on the snow. 100 kilograms of venison, 50 kilograms of fish, salt, 10 hides for warmth, hot stones wrapped in rags. The people from Kraugholm looked at it all and said nothing. One of the men sat down in the snow and covered his face with his hands. The woman just stood there and watched. Then she bent down and began loading the meat onto the sled. Silently, quickly, efficiently. Dan looked at her. Big, strong, dark hair tied back in a bun, hands covered in scars, not from the cold, from fire. He asked who she was. She said her name was Mira, that she was the blacksmith's widow, that she was one of those who would stay behind to work. Dan nodded. Mira loaded the sled and sent 2 men back. She stayed behind. She looked at Dan and said she was ready. Dan asked what for. Mira said anything, as long as her children had something to eat. Mira didn't just work. She was on fire. From day 1. Bjorn put her to work on the ice house. She cleaned it out in half a day. She restocked the supplies. She scraped the ice off the walls. She repaired the lid. Then she came to Dan and said the ice house was too small, that they needed a second one. Dan looked at her and realized he'd found his manager. Mira knew how the operation worked. She'd run the blacksmith shop after her husband. She kept track of coal and iron. She knew what inventory and consumption meant. Dan explained the concept of man days to her. She understood it in a minute. It took Line 10 minutes. Mira, just 1. 3 days later, she was already taking inventory alongside Dan. A week later, she was doing it better than he was, because she had no mental stockpile to fall back on. She counted the way a person does when every single piece counts, with no room for error. Dan learned her story bit by bit, not because she told it, because others did. Bjorn said that Mira had brought with her from Kraugholm not only her 3 children, but also 5 others' children. She'd gathered them along the way. Other people's children, orphans, lost souls. She picked them up like things on the side of the road, silently, without questions. She'd simply take them by the hand and lead them on. 8 children, 1 woman, through the winter forest. A 2-day journey. Grimm said that Mira's husband had been a good blacksmith, that he died of starvation, not from illness, not from a wild animal, from starvation. Because he gave his food to the children, all of his portions, down to the last bite, until he collapsed by the anvil and couldn't get back up. Mira buried him herself. She dug a grave in the frozen ground with her bare hands. It took her a whole day. Her fingernails were black for another month after that. Dan didn't talk to her about it. He didn't ask. He just worked beside her. And he noticed. He noticed that Mira never ate first. She always fed the children, her own and others, then the rest, and only then did she eat herself, if there was anything left. Often, there wasn't. She was losing weight. Dan saw her cheekbones becoming more prominent, her hands growing thinner. She worked herself to the bone and ate last. He waited a week. Then one evening he cooked dinner, separate from the communal pot, just for her. Venison with wild onions and salt, hot, a full bowl. He went to her hut. 8 children were sleeping haphazardly on animal skins. Mira was sitting by the hearth, mending someone's shirt. Dan set the bowl down in front of her. Mira looked at it, then at the children, then at Dan. She said, "The children." Dan said the children had been fed, that he'd checked on each one, that Tim had brought them fish an hour ago, that they were full, all 8 of them, that now it was her turn. Mira stared at the bowl. Dan put his hand on her shoulder. He said one word. Eat. Mira picked up a spoon. Her hand was shaking. She brought the first spoonful to her mouth. She ate it. The second. The third. She ate in silence. Tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped into the bowl. She didn't wipe them away. She just ate and cried. Dan sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there. When the bowl was empty, Mira set it down on the floor. She looked at Dan. She said quietly, "Thank you." Dan said that tomorrow would be the same, and the day after tomorrow, that she would no longer be the last to eat, that this was an order. Mira opened her mouth to object. Dan said it was an order, that a warehouse manager who was starving to death was a bad manager, that she needed her strength, that the children needed her alive, not dead. Mira closed her mouth. She nodded. Once. On the 72nd day, the village was a different place. Dan could see it in the numbers and in the faces. The numbers. There were 400 kilograms of meat in the warehouse, 150 kilograms of fish. The ice house was full. The second ice house, which Mira had been digging with 3 helpers, was half finished. The faces. The children were running between the huts, laughing. They were fighting over sticks. Normal childhood behavior that hadn't been seen for 2 months. The women were doing laundry and chatting. The men were repairing walls and roofs. Tim was commanding 3 teenagers on the snare line like a little sergeant. Grimm went into the forest every day and came back with game. Not always, but more often than before. Era would go out on reconnaissance and return with a mental map of the tracks. She'd show Dan where a moose had passed, where she'd seen fresh wild boar tracks, where she'd found the den of a bear that was sleeping and was best left alone. Solveig was treating 4 patients at once, and for the first time in 2 years, none of them were dying. Bjorn. Bjorn had changed the most. He stopped coming to Dan with the face of a man who'd been humiliated. He came with the face of a man who was working. His questions had changed. Not what Dan was doing or why, but how many planks were needed for the second glacier shelter, and whether they could put up a palisade on the north side of the rampart, because the wind from that direction was blowing the roof off old Torque's house. On the 75th day, Dan saw his first real sunrise. The sun crept over the horizon and hung low, red, dull, cold, but real. The light fell on the snow, and the snow sparkled. Lena stood next to him on the rampart and squinted. She said it hurt her eyes. Dan said that was normal, that her eyes weren't used to it anymore. They stood there looking at the sun, and Dan thought that in his past life, he had never looked at the sun just like that. It was there, always, every day. He hadn't noticed. Here, the sun was an event, a celebration. Lena squinted and smiled. Dan remembered that smile. He put it on a shelf in his mind, not in the storage area, on another shelf, the one he couldn't explain and didn't try to. With the sun came warmth, relative warmth, -20 instead of -40. For Solgear, it was summer. The snow began to settle, not melt. Spring was still far off, but it was settling. The trails widened. The forest became passable. The game had returned to Zone A. The snares were bursting at the seams. Dan was bagging 10 hares a day. The pits were set every 2 days. Era led him to places even Grim didn't know about. She found herds 5 kilometers away. She guided Dan along the trail quietly and precisely. They worked in silence, in perfect harmony, like two warehouse workers on an assembly line who know each other's movements without words. Dan's stockpile was growing. 500 kilograms, 600, 700. He counted and saw that, for the first time since waking up, his stockpile was outpacing his consumption. The curve was going up, steeply, confidently. On the 78th day, a second merchant arrived. Not Gunner, another one. A young man, with 2 sleds and 3 horses. He was carrying fabric, thread, needles, arrowheads, and something unexpected. Notebooks. Real ones. Paper bound in a thin leather cover. 12 of them. Dan saw them and his breath caught in his throat. Paper. Real paper. He bought all 12. He paid 20 kilograms of venison for them. The merchant thought he'd ripped off a foolish boy. Dan thought he'd ripped off a greedy merchant. 20 kilograms of meat for 12 notebooks. He'd be able to get the meat in 2 days. He wouldn't be able to get the notebooks anywhere else. He gave 4 notebooks to Lena. She grabbed them with both hands and pressed them to her chest. Her eyes grew huge. She had never held real paper in her hands before. Dan kept 2 notebooks for himself, for record keeping. He gave one to Solveig to write down medicine recipes. He gave one to Mira to keep track of the glacier. He put 4 away in the storeroom, a reserve. The notebooks in the storeroom wouldn't yellow or get damp. In 10 years, they'd be just the same. Lena sat down in the corner of the hut and began copying her notes from the leather notebook into the paper one. Carefully, diligently, her tongue sticking out from the effort. Dan watched her and thought that if he taught this girl to truly read and count, in 10 years she would be running trade across half the continent. And not under his orders, on her own. On the 80th day, Ida came to Dan's cabin. This was unusual. She never came on her own. Dan went to her. He brought her food. He invited her on hunting trips. She went, but never on her own. Ira stood in the doorway, looking hesitant. For a woman who moves through the forest silently and shoots deer right in the nerve center, she looked surprisingly uncertain. Dan asked what was wrong. Ira paused. Then she said she wanted to eat with people. Not alone. With people. In the communal house. Dan looked at her. He didn't understand at first. Then he did. Ira ate alone. Always. He'd bring her a bowl to her hut. She'd take it and close the door. She'd eat in solitude, like a beast hiding with its prey. Not because she was greedy, because she was used to it. At the Haravna Guild, she wasn't invited to the communal table. She ate separately, like a tool. Find some prey, get your share. Go. Dan nodded. He said there would be a communal dinner that evening, that she would sit next to him. Ira stood there. Then she nodded and left, quickly, as if she were afraid she'd change her mind. She arrived that evening. She stood by the edge of the hearth, watching the people, 118 people who were eating, talking, and laughing. Dan walked over, took her by the sleeve, led her to a bench, and sat her down. Lena, Solveig, Mira, with her two youngest children, Tim and Grim, sat down beside her. Dan set a bowl in front of Ada. Venison with lingonberries, her favorite, with the tart berries, which he'd kept in storage especially for her. Ada picked up a spoon. She ate slowly, staring into the bowl, not at the people. Lena, sitting next to her, swung her legs back and forth and told Tim about human days. Tim listened with a serious expression. Solveig was scolding Grim for going into Zone B alone again. Grim brushed it off. Mira was feeding someone else's child who had climbed onto her lap. An ordinary evening. Ordinary people. Ordinary food. Ada finished eating. She put down her spoon. She sat quietly. She didn't leave. She sat there, listening to the voices around her. An hour later, when everyone started to leave, she stood up. She looked at Dan. She said one word. Tomorrow. Dan nodded. Tomorrow, she would come again. And the day after tomorrow. And in a week. She would keep coming because, for the first time in many years, she had somewhere to go. On the 83rd day, what Dan had both been waiting for and dreading happened. The Hravna Guild. 5 men on skis, armed, bows, knives, short spears. Leading the way was a man Dan had never seen before, but had heard of, Kai the Sharp, the guild's emissary. Short, wiry, a face as if carved from stone, eyes cold and intelligent. He did not enter the village through the gate, over the rampart. He stepped over it, as if it were a fence. Because the rampart wasn't very high, because the village wasn't a fortress. Bjorn came out to meet him. Grim stood next to his axe. Dan stood behind them. Ada saw Kai from the window of her hut and turned pale. Dan noticed. He walked over to her. He told her quietly to stay inside. Ada shook her head. She said she wouldn't hide. She came out. She stood next to Dan. Kai saw her. He smiled, subtly, like a man who had found something he'd lost. Kai spoke politely, gently. His voice was soft. His words were precise. He said that the Northern Hunters Guild was glad that Solgeir was alive, that this was good news, that the guild had always supported the northern villages, that the guild had rules. One of those rules is the winter tithe. Every village in the north gives the guild a tenth of its winter catch in exchange for protection, for trade routes, for aid during years of famine. He said this and looked at Dan. He smiled. He asked if it was true that there was a young hunter in Solgeir with an unusual gift. Dan stepped forward. He said it was true. Kai looked at him, appraisingly, like a buyer examining merchandise. He said that the guild would like to discuss the terms of cooperation, that the tithe was standard, but for special cases, there were special terms. After Kai left, Dan worked like a man possessed. Every day in the forest, from dawn till dusk, Era by his side. They ventured into Zone B and even beyond its borders. Era found herds. Dan set traps. Grim joined them whenever he could. Tim set up a line of snares in Zone A by himself. Mira managed the ice house and distribution. Bjorn oversaw the work to reinforce the rampart. The operation was up and running. Every detail was in its place, just like a conveyor belt at a warehouse in Seattle. Only instead of frozen pizza, reindeer were moving down the conveyor belt. In 3 weeks, Dan had tripled their supplies. 1,200 kilograms of meat in storage, 400 fish, 80 hides, salt, dried herbs. He counted everything every evening. Lena took notes. Mira cross-checked with the ice cave. 3 people kept track of supplies for an entire village. Dan thought that in his past life, 15 people had worked in the warehouse and mixed up orders every other time. Here, the 3 of them managed better because a mistake didn't result in a fine from the manager, it meant death. Spring was approaching. The snow had settled to half a meter deep. The stream began to murmur louder beneath the ice. Birds appeared, small and gray. Dan didn't know their names, but Era did. She'd point them out to him and whisper the name, just one word. Dan would repeat it, and Era would nod. A rhythm developed between them. Hunting in the morning, scouting in the afternoon, dinner together in the evening. After dinner, Dan would go check on the village. Era would go with him. Not because he asked her to, she just went, beside him, silently. Sometimes he caught her gaze. She would look away. He didn't press the issue. He didn't ask. He just kept walking. Lena noticed and said that Era followed him like a puppy. Dan said that Era wasn't a puppy. Lena said she knew that Era was a wolf. But she followed him anyway. Dan said nothing. On the 90th day, a delegation arrived from Craigholm. Olaf sent 2 men with a sleigh. They brought gifts, not meat. Olaf was too proud for meat. He sent charcoal, real charcoal, 3 sacks, for a forge. Solgeir didn't have a forge, but Solgeir had Mira. Mira saw the charcoal and froze. She stood there, staring at the black chunks as if they were gold. Then she turned to Dan and said she needed an anvil. Dan asked why. Mira said they were running out of arrowheads, that the knives were dull, that there were only 4 working axes for the whole village, that if she set up a forge, in a month, every hunter would have a decent knife and a decent arrowhead. Dan looked at her hands, scarred from forging. He asked if she knew how to forge. Mira looked at him in a way that made him regret asking. She said her husband had taught her, that she'd forged alongside him for 6 years, that after his death, she'd kept the forge running on her own for 4 months until the coal ran out. Dan nodded. He said there would be an anvil. Mira asked where it would come from. Dan said he'd find one. Grim found the anvil. 3 days' journey to the east lay a deserted village. Grim knew about it. He'd been there in the fall. Everyone had died or left. The smithy stood empty. The anvil was inside. Grim took Tim and 2 men from Craigholm who had stayed behind to work. They were gone for 3 days and returned with the anvil on a sled. It was heavy, 60 kilograms. They dragged it through the snow for 3 days. Grim said it was the heaviest load he'd ever hauled in his life. Heavier than a bear. Dan thanked him. He took the best cut of venison he had from the storeroom. Thick, fatty, with marbling. Grim took it and left. At the doorway, he turned around and said that Dan was a good boy. Then he left. Dan stood there smiling because a 50-year-old hunter with scars from bear claws had called him a good boy. And that was the best compliment he'd ever received in his entire life. Both lives. Mira set up the forge in 2 days. She found a spot on the edge of the village where the wind blew well, where the sparks wouldn't reach the roofs. She built a bellows out of stones, set up the anvil, stoked the first fire. Dan stood nearby and watched her work. At the anvil, Mira was a different person. Not quiet, not reserved. She struck the anvil with a force that made his ears ring. Blow after blow, precise, rhythmic. Sparks flew. The metal glowed red and bent. From a shapeless chunk of iron, she forged an arrowhead. Smooth, sharp, with a barbed edge. She made the first arrowhead in an hour, the second in 40 minutes, the third in 20. Her hands remembered. By the end of the first day, she had 10 arrowheads. Dan took one. He turned it over in his fingers. Heavy, well balanced. He didn't know much about weapons, but he could recognize quality, just as he could recognize the quality of goods in a warehouse, by weight, by the feel in his hand. This arrowhead was good. The forge had changed the village just as much as the glacier had, maybe even more. Now they had more than just meat. They had tools. Mira forged knives, arrowheads, fishing hooks, door hinges, nails, staples. Every item was small. Every item was important. Dan watched as the village became interwoven with iron, as hunters came to Mira with dull knives and left with sharp ones, as Tim got his first real knife and wore it on his belt without ever taking it off. How Grim brought Mira a broken axe and she welded on a new blade. Iron is the lifeblood of civilization. Dan didn't know this from books. He knew it from life. In a warehouse, nothing works without a forklift. Here, nothing works without a knife. Mira became their forklift. On the 95th day, Dan called a council meeting. It was the first council in Solgir's history, where the village elder wasn't the only one to speak. Bjorn, Grim, Solveig, and Mira were there. Eira stood by the wall. Lena sat in the corner with a notebook. Dan spoke about the guild, about Kai, about the fact that the guild would return, not with 5 fighters, but with 3 dozen, maybe more. Bjorn nodded. He knew that. Grim was silent. He knew it too. Solveig cursed and asked when. Dan said they had a month, maybe a month and a half. Mira asked what he was proposing. Dan began to explain. He said they couldn't go to war with the guild. The guild had 30 trained hunters. Each of them had killed beasts heavier than a horse. Solgir had 10 men who could handle weapons. 4 of them are old men. You can't win by force. But Dan wasn't planning to win by force. He was planning to win through logistics. He explained. The guild would come from Hravna. That's a 5-day journey. They bring 10 days worth of supplies with them. 5 for the trip there, 5 for the trip back. If they stayed longer, their supplies would run out. In the middle of winter in the north, there's no food to be found along the way. All you have is what you carry with you. Dan proposed the following. Buy up all the supplies within a 100-kilometer radius, through merchants, through Olaf in Cragholm, through anyone who's selling. Gather it all into their own warehouse. When the guild arrives and sets up camp near the village, Dan will simply wait. A day, 2, 5, until their food runs out. A hungry soldier doesn't fight. A hungry soldier goes home. Bjorn listened. Then he said it was madness. That Dan wanted to buy up all the food in the north? Dan said not all of it, just enough so that between Hravn and Solgir there wouldn't be a single supply the guild could count on along the way. Mira said that would require a huge amount of meat to trade. Dan nodded. He said he had over a metric ton in his warehouse. The room fell silent. A metric ton of meat. Bjorn looked at Dan. Grim looked. Solveig looked. Even Ada turned her head. A metric ton. 1 man. All by himself. Dan didn't bother to explain. He said the issue wasn't the quantity, it was a matter of time. Would they make it in time? Grim said he knew of 3 trading posts between Solgir and Hraun, 2 abandoned villages where supplies might still be left, and 1 guild hunting base located halfway there. If they cut off that base, the guild would lose its transit point. Dan asked how to cut it off. Grim said to buy it all up, or raid it. Dan nodded. He said that Grim would head northeast to the trading posts, with meat and hides. He'll buy up everything he can. Mira will go to Olaf in Cragholm. She'll negotiate a joint warehouse. Eira will go on a reconnaissance mission to the guild's hunting base. She'll check out what's there and how many people are there. Bjorn will stay in the village and reinforce the rampart. Dan will continue hunting and stockpiling supplies. Solveig asked, "What about me?" Dan looked at her. He said she would prepare medicines, because if it comes to a clash, there will be wounded. And because right now, the most important thing she can do is keep people healthy. Healthy people work. Sick people don't. Solveig snorted, but she nodded. The meeting ended. Everyone dispersed. Lena stayed behind. She looked at Dan and asked what she would be doing. Dan crouched down in front of her. He said she would keep track of everything. Every single item that comes in and goes out. Every man day, every pelt, and every arrowhead. She would be his eyes in the warehouse when he wasn't there. Lena straightened up. She nodded. Seriously, like a little soldier. Dan thought that an 8-year-old girl shouldn't be a soldier. But in this world, 8-year-old girls are either soldiers or dead. Grim left the next morning, with a sled, with 50 kilograms of meat and 20 hides to trade. Mira left for Craigholm 2 days later. Era went into the forest alone. Dan stayed behind. He hunted with Tim. The boy had grown over those months. Not physically, inside. He set snares silently and precisely. He gutted hares with a single knife in 5 minutes. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He worked. Dan saw himself in him. Not the Dan who was a logistics specialist. The Dan who was a boy working in a warehouse at night because his mother was sick and the bills wouldn't wait. Tim worked because his mother was sick and food wouldn't wait. One pain, different worlds. Ira returned 4 days later. She came at night, quietly, like a shadow. Dan didn't hear her enter the village. He just opened the cabin door in the morning, and there she was, sitting on a log by the entrance, asleep, leaning against the wall, a knife in her hand. Even in her sleep, Dan woke her gently. She opened her eyes instantly. The knife jerked upward. Then she saw his face and lowered her hand. Dan asked what she'd found. Ira went inside. Lena gave her some hot broth. Ira warmed her hands on the bowl and told him what had happened. The guild's hunting base is 2 days' journey to the east. It's large. 3 houses, a palisade, 4 people inside, guards. Supplies are scarce. A barrel of salted meat, a sack of flour, dried meat. Enough for a 30-person squad for 3 days. No more. Dan listened and did the math. 3 days. If we take this outpost out of the equation, the guild's detachment will have to carry everything with them for 10 days. For 30 men. That's 900 kilograms at a minimum. Each fighter carries 30 kilos, in addition to weapons and gear. That will slow them down, wear them out, weaken them. And by the time they reach Soul Gear, they'll be angry and exhausted, with enough supplies for 2 or 3 days of the return trip. Dan smiled, for the first time in a week. He asked Etta if they could approach the base unnoticed. Etta nodded. She said the guards were lazy. They didn't go beyond the palisade. They didn't patrol. They just sat by the fire. Dan asked if they could buy supplies from them. Etta looked at him with an expression that said he'd lost his mind. She said it was a guild base. They wouldn't sell. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said that in that case, he'd offer them something else. Not a purchase, a trade. Meat for meat. Fresh, hot meat for old, salted meat. 1 for 1. Who would turn that down? Etta thought for a moment and said no one would, because fresh meat in winter is worth its weight in gold, and salted meat is just salted meat. Dan nodded. He said he'd go himself. Etta said she'd go with him. Dan wanted to say no. He looked at her. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. Dan and Etta set out for the guild's base at dawn on the 3rd day of their journey. They traveled light. Dan carried only a knife and a flask of water. Everything else was in storage. Era carried a bow and 5 arrows that Mira had forged for her. New, sharp, with smooth fletching that Era had trimmed herself, feather by feather. The base stood in a clearing amid a dense spruce forest. 3 log cabins, a palisade of sharpened stakes. The gate was open. Smoke was rising from one chimney. Era said there were 2 people inside. The other 2 were gone, probably out hunting. Dan nodded. They waited. An hour later, one of the guards came out to gather firewood. A burly man, a beard, an axe slung over his shoulder. Dan stood up and walked toward him openly, along the path, without hiding. The guard saw him and froze. His hand reached for the axe. Dan raised his hands, empty, no weapons. He said he'd come to trade. The guard looked at him suspiciously, asked who he was. Dan said he was from Soul Gear, that he had fresh meat, that he wanted to trade it for salted meat, 1 for 1. The guard narrowed his eyes, asked why. Dan said he needed the salted meat for curing, that he had fresh meat but no salted meat. The guard thought for a moment. He called over the second guard. The second one came out, smaller, with a long scar across his cheek. They exchanged glances. Then the first one said to let him see the meat. Dan pulled a piece of venison from his bosom, still steaming, fresh. In the icy air, steam rose from it in a column. Both guards stared at it. The first one reached out, took it, sniffed it, took a bite, chewed. His eyes widened. He said it was the best meat he'd eaten in 3 months. Dan said he had more, plenty, as much as they needed, 1 to 1 for the salted meat. The guards exchanged glances. They asked how much he had. Dan said 50 kilograms. The guards went inside. They returned with a barrel, salted meat, 40 kilograms. Dan laid out 40 kilograms of fresh venison in front of them, right on the snow, piece by piece, out of nowhere. The guards watched. The first one stopped chewing. The second took a step back. Dan said calmly that he was a hunter from Soul Gear, that he had a gift, that the gift was harmless. He just stores it. The first guard looked at the second. The second shrugged and said he didn't care about the gift as long as the meat was real. They began loading the salted venison into bags. Dan helped. They worked in silence. When they finished, the first guard asked why he needed so much salted venison. Dan said it was a big village, lots of mouths to feed. The guard nodded. He didn't press the issue. Dan took the barrel. He sent the salted meat to the warehouse. Shelf B1. Salted meat. 40 kilograms. Fair condition. He left the barrel behind. It was heavy. On the way back, Ada was silent longer than usual. Then she said he was taking a risk. That when Hrauven found out someone had bought up his base's supplies, he'd figure out who it was. Dan said, let him figure it out. By that time, the base would be empty, and the guild would be heading out fully loaded. Ada paused and said that Dan thinks like a wolf, not like a human. A wolf doesn't fight a bear. A wolf waits until the bear gets tired. Dan looked at her and said that was a compliment. Ada turned away. Her ears turned red. Grimm returned the day after they did. The result? 2 trading posts had been cleared out. Grimm traded the meat and hides for everything that was there. 20 kilograms of dried fish, 15 kilograms of flour, salt, 10 arrowheads, and ropes. The third outpost was empty, looted. By whom? No one knew. Grimm said that between Soul Gear and Crown, there was only one place left with supplies. An abandoned village a day and a half's journey to the east. There might be supplies in the cellars there. Dan sent Tim with 2 teenagers to gather whatever they could find. Tim nodded and left. He returned 3 days later. With 20 kilograms of frozen turnips, 5 sacks of grain he'd found in the cellar of an empty house, and one thing that surprised Dan. A book. A real one. Handwritten. Thick. Bound in leather. Tim had found it in the house of the village headman of the abandoned village. He didn't know what to do with it. He took it because Dan loves paper. Dan took the book. He opened it. It was the village chronicle. 50 years worth of records. Births, deaths, harvests, hunts, winters. And on the last pages, entries about the White Forest, about how the beast departs, about how tracks appeared, about how hunters disappeared, about the Silent One. Dan read until morning. Lena slept. He sat by the fire and turned the pages. And with every page, the picture became clearer. The White Forest was sick. 10 years ago, something changed. The beast began to leave. The ice set in earlier. The blizzards grew fiercer, and the Silent One, who had once lived in the deepest depths and left people alone, began to emerge, slowly, year after year, closer. The last entry in the chronicle was brief. The hunter Ragnar did not return, the third in a month. We're heading south. May the gods forgive us. Mira returned from Cragholm 2 days later. She brought 10 people with her, 5 men, 3 women, 2 teenagers. Olaf had sent his best. Not the hungriest, as Dan had asked, the best. Because Olaf understood. If Solgeir falls, Cragholm will be next. Mira said she'd negotiated a joint warehouse. Cragholm will store part of the supplies there. If the guild comes to Solgeir, Cragholm will take in the refugees. If the guild goes to Cragholm, Solgeir will take them in. 2 fists. 1 fist is easy to crush. 2 are harder. Dan listened and told Mira she was a genius. Mira shrugged and said it was just common sense. Then she went to the anvil. By the 100th day, Dan felt he was ready. There were 1.5 metric tons of meat in the warehouse, 400 kilograms of fish, 300 kilograms of grain, flour, and turnips, salt, hides, tools. There wasn't a single supply point between Hrauven and Solgeir. Cragholm was an ally. The rampart was fortified. The forge was operational. Every hunter had a new knife and arrowheads. Era had 6 arrows. Grim had a sharpened axe. Mira had a hammer powerful enough to bring down a bull. Dan stood on the rampart and looked east, toward where the guild would come from, and waited. The first day of the siege passed in silence. The guild had set up camp. Solgeir stood behind the rampart. No one moved. No one shouted. No one fired. Dan sat on the rampart and watched. 30 tents, 30 campfires, 30 hunters sitting and eating. Dan counted. 30 people. At least 600 grams of meat per day. 18 kilograms per day. They'd come with supplies, maybe 300 kilograms. The sleds were loaded, but 300 divided by 30 is 10 days. Minus 5 days of travel here is 5 days here. Minus 5 days for the return trip, that's 0. They didn't have enough supplies for a siege. They'd come for a quick result. They'd come to intimidate, to take what they wanted, to leave. Dan knew that, and he waited. On the second day, one man broke away from the camp. He was heading toward the rampart, alone, unarmed. Dan saw him and stood up. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, a dark bearskin coat, a weather-beaten face, a graying beard. His eyes were dark and heavy. Hraun Ingvarsson, head of the Northern Hunters Guild, a former great hunter. The man who, 20 years ago, had slain the ancient beast and received the gift of sensing another's gift. He approached the rampart and stopped. He looked at Dan. Dan was standing at the top, looking down, silent. Hraun spoke. His voice was deep and steady, without malice or threat, like that of a man accustomed to being listened to. Hraun said he could sense Dan's gift, that he could smell it from a distance of 10 days' journey, that the gift was immense, indescribable, that over the past 20 years he had sensed hundreds of gifts, a sense of blood, night vision, resistance to the cold, minor gifts, useful, ordinary. But Dan's gift is different. It smells different, deeper, more ancient, as if something very old stands behind it. Crown said that such gifts are dangerous, that they attract attention, not people's, the one in the forests. Crown said he knows about the Silent One, that the Silent One has been on the move for the past 10 years, that he used to be deep within. Now he's closer, closer with every passing year, and that Dan's gift could speed that up, that the gift is a beacon, and that a beacon must either be extinguished or controlled. The guild can control it. Dan cannot. A single boy in a small village cannot. Craven said he hadn't come to take it away. He'd come to make an offer. Dan would join the guild, come under its protection, pay a tithe, and Craven would personally see to it that the Silent One didn't reach Soul Gear. Dan listened, silently, until the very end. Then he was silent for a while longer. Craven waited patiently. Dan spoke, quietly, calmly. He said he'd heard about the guild from Ida Sna. Craven's eyebrow twitched slightly at the mention of Ida's name. Dan said that Ida had told him how the guild had treated her for telling the truth, how the senior hunter had hidden supplies while families starved, how Craven had taken his side, how Ida had been driven out without food in the winter, that the guild, which expels the best tracker in the north for his honesty, cannot offer protection. It can offer only submission. Crown remained silent. His expression did not change. Dan continued. He said he knew about the gift beacon, that he would handle it himself, that Soul Gear would not join the guild, that there would be no tithe, that Crown could stand there as long as he wanted, but his men's food would run out before Dan's patience did. Crown looked at him for a long time. Then he said quietly that the boy didn't understand what he was playing with, that the gift wasn't a toy, that Dan's father had also thought he could handle it on his own. And where was his father now? Dan felt something tighten inside him. It hurt, sharply. Crown had seen it. He knew exactly where to strike. He turned and walked back to the camp. Dan stood on the rampart and watched him go. His hands didn't tremble. His face didn't flinch. But inside, everything was shaking. The third day, the guild hadn't moved. Dan hadn't moved. The camp stood its ground. The village carried on. Dan pointedly organized a communal dinner on the rampart in full view of the guild. 130 people ate hot meat with lingonberries, steaming, fragrant. The scent drifted all the way to the camp. Dan knew this. The wind was blowing that way. He had deliberately chosen a time when the wind was blowing toward the camp. Logistics. The smell of hot meat is a weapon to a hungry person. Quieter than an arrow, more effective than a spear. Day 4. One of the guild's hunters came to the rampart. Not Craven, an ordinary fighter, young, hungry. He asked if he could buy some meat. Dan asked what he'd pay for it. The guy pulled a knife from his bosom, a good one, steel, with a bone handle. Dan took the knife, looked it over, handed it to Mira. Mira nodded. Good steel. Dan gave the guy 5 kilograms of venison, hot. The guy grabbed the meat and ran back to camp. An hour later, a second one arrived, with a pair of boots. Dan gave him meat. By evening, 4 had come. They traded weapons and clothes for food. Dan traded with them, each one, personally. No haggling, no humiliation. He simply took the item and gave them meat. Steaming, fresh, out of nowhere. Craven's men saw this. They saw the meat appear in the boy's hands out of thin air. They saw the steam rising from it. They saw their comrades eating and unable to stop. And every one of them thought the same thing. Why are we standing here? The 5th day, Craven went out to the rampart again. Alone. Dan came down to meet him. Alone. They stood facing each other. Hraven said his men were starving, that their supplies had run out yesterday, that he hadn't found the supply depot because it was empty, that he understood what Dan had done. He'd bought up all the supplies between Hraven and Solgear, cut off their supply lines, left the guild with no way back. Hraven said it was clever, very clever, even too clever for a 23-year-old boy. Then he said he could give the order, and 30 hunters would take Solgear in an hour. The rampart isn't high. There are few defenders. Mira with her hammer and Aira with her bow won't be able to stop 30 men. Dan stood there and listened. Then he replied, quietly. He said that Hraven was right. Solgear wouldn't withstand an assault. 30 hunters would take the village. They'll kill the defenders. Maybe they'll kill him. But if they kill him, his storehouse will be lost. 1.5 metric tons of meat, 400 kilograms of fish, all the grain, all the salt, everything. It will be gone. And 30 hunters will be left in the middle of the barren north without food, without a supply base. 5 days' journey from home, without supplies. They won't make it, not a single one. Hraven can take Solgear, but he'll lose 30 men, his hunters, who have wives and children waiting at home. Hraven was silent for a long time. The wind carried snow between them. Then he asked quietly what Dan wanted. Dan said he wanted one thing, for Hraven to lead his men home, alive and well-fed, and for the guild to never come to Solgear for tribute again. Hraven asked, and what in return? Dan produced meat out of thin air, a lot of it, piece by piece. He laid it out on the snow in front of Hraven, floating, fresh, 50 kilograms, 100, 150. The pile of meat grew. Steam rose in a column. Hraven watched. His hunters from the camp watched. Everyone watched. Dan laid out 200 kilograms. He stopped. He said that would be enough for Hraven to bring his people home. All 30 of them, with plenty to spare. He said it wasn't a tribute. It was a gift. Because Hraven's people had wives and children at home, and they were waiting. He named 2 of them, Asa and Thor, the children of Kai the Sharp. Kai was standing in the camp and heard it. Dan saw him flinch. Dan said he knew their names, that he'd learned them from the traders, that Kai was a good father and his children were waiting for him alive, that they were all waiting for their loved ones to return alive, that Dan wasn't an enemy, he was a provider, and he wanted to provide, not to fight. Hraven stood there. He looked at the 200 kilograms of hot meat lying in the snow, then at the boy standing before him, then at his own hands. Heavy, scarred. The hands of a hunter who had spent 20 years killing so that the northern villages could survive. And now, standing before him was another man, one who provided food so that they could survive. Hraven turned toward the camp. He said one word, "Let's go." 30 hunters began to break camp, silently, quickly. Kai walked over to Dan. He looked at him. Kai's face was gray. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then he nodded, once, and walked over to the sleds. The guild left by evening. 200 kilograms of meat on the sleds. Dan stood on the embankment and watched as the column headed east. 30 dots on the white snow, getting smaller and smaller, getting farther and farther away. Then they disappeared. Lena stood beside him. She was holding his hand. Silently. Era stood nearby. Silently. Bjorn stood nearby. Grim stood nearby. Solveig stood nearby. Mira stood nearby. Tim stood nearby. They stood and looked toward the east. Then Bjorn turned toward the village and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "We have 320 man-days until spring." He didn't even realize why he'd said that. Lena giggled. Tim smiled. Grim snorted. Solveig said that Bjorn was an idiot and that it wasn't 320 but 280 until spring. Bjorn started arguing. Mira said they were both wrong and that they needed to count again. Lena took out her notebook and began counting. Dan stood there listening. Voices, arguments, laughter. The lively sounds of a lively village. And he thought this was the best evening of both his lives. Then he turned toward the west, toward the white forest. A dark strip on the horizon. Silent. Waiting. Grauven said that Dan's father thought he could handle it on his own. Grauven said that the gift was a beacon. Grauven said something else before leaving, quietly, so that only Dan could hear. He said he sensed another gift in the forest. Old, weak, fading, like embers about to go out. He said that this gift smelled just like Dan's gift, exactly the same. Father. Dan stood facing the forest, clenching his fists. Father is alive, somewhere deep in the white forest. Alive. Still alive. And Dan will go after him. Not now, not today, but he will go. Because he's a logistics specialist, and he doesn't leave a single item in the warehouse unaccounted for. Even if that item is his father. Even if the warehouse is the white forest. Even if the storekeeper is the silent one. Spring arrived on the 120th day. Not right away, not warm. But the snow began to melt. Streams broke through. The ice on the river cracked with a roar that the whole village heard. The children ran out onto the embankment and watched as the gray water broke up the white slabs. Lena stood among them and laughed. Dan watched her from the doorway of the hut and counted. 120 days. 4 months. Solgeir is alive. 130 people, including those from Craigholm. There's over a metric ton of meat in the warehouse. The ice house is full. The forge is working. The rampart is reinforced. The guild is gone. The first winter is behind them. He did it. No, they did it. But spring brought more than just warmth. It brought people. Merchants came more often, once a week. Word of Solgeir spread across the north like a crack in the ice. The village that survived the hungry decade. The village with meat and iron and a herbalist. A village where people are fed. The merchants came with goods and left with stories. They told them at every stop. A boy who pulls meat out of thin air. Hot at -40. Floating in the wind. Sorcery. A gift. A miracle. Dan knew these stories would bring trouble, but for now, they brought in the merchants. And the merchants brought salt and iron and cloth and seeds. Yes, seeds. Dan bought turnip and barley seeds from a merchant from the south. He traded 30 kilograms of venison for them. The merchant looked at him as if he were crazy. Seeds in winter, up north, where nothing grows. Dan put the seeds in storage. Shelf G1. Seeds, turnips, barley, in perfect condition. Indefinite shelf life. He thought about the land, about how the village couldn't survive on hunting forever. The game is disappearing, further away every year. The white forest is retreating. Or perhaps the opposite. It's advancing. It depends on your point of view. The ground here is frozen 8 months a year. But there are 3 months of summer. A short, harsh summer with white nights when the sun never sets. 3 months isn't enough for wheat, but it's enough for turnips, for barley, for cabbage, if they're lucky. Dan began planting vegetable gardens. He marked out plots on the southern slope behind the embankment. That's where the snow melted first. The ground warmed up faster there. Bjorn looked at his drawings and shook his head. He said that they'd never planted crops in Solgire. that it was a village of hunters, not farmers. Dan said that a village of hunters that doesn't plant crops is a village that will die when the game disappears. Bjorn fell silent. Then he nodded. Lena helped prepare the garden beds. She was 9. She had grown over these past months. Not taller, but wider. Her cheeks had turned rosy. Her arms had grown stronger. She no longer looked like a skeleton covered in skin. She looked like a child, normal, healthy, well-fed. Dan looked at her every day and reminded himself every day why they were doing all this. Lena counted the seeds. She wrote down in a notebook how many they'd planted and where. She labeled the rows with sticks bearing scratched-in letters. Turnips, barley, cabbage. She approached this with the seriousness of a surgeon. Dan thought that in 10 years, this girl would be running the agriculture of the entire North, and that was no exaggeration. On the 130th day, a delegation arrived that Dan hadn't been expecting. 5 people, 4 men and 1 girl. Not traders, not hunters, refugees. From a village far to the north. A village whose name Dan didn't know. They had been walking for 10 days. 2 of them were carrying a third who couldn't walk. His leg was broken. They had come because they'd heard about soul gear. The eldest among them, a man of about 40 with a frostbitten face, said that their village was dead, that the beast had left, that the silent one had come. Not close by, but close enough for people to start leaving. Those who didn't leave died. They were the last ones. Dan took them in. He fed them. Solveig tended to the broken leg. Mira found them a place in one of the empty houses. Lena brought hot stones. Era silently left some fresh fish at their door. Tim brought firewood. Among the refugees was a girl. Young, petite, shoulder-length black hair. Always wearing 3 layers of clothing and still shivering from the cold. Her name was Hana Yoon, the daughter of a merchant from the south. She wasn't from their village. She had been traveling north with her father and got stranded when the village began to die. Her father had gone south for help 2 months ago and hadn't returned. Hana waited. Then she stopped waiting and went with the refugees. She was annoyingly chatty for someone who'd been walking through the snow for 10 days without food. The first thing she told Dan was that his barter system with the merchants was inefficient. Dan looked at her. She stood before him holding a bowl of hot broth and explained that he was selling meat too cheaply, that fresh meat in winter was worth 4 times what he was charging. If he tallied up his trades over the past month, he'd lost the equivalent of 200 kilograms of meat on bad deals. Dan listened. Then he asked how she knew. Hana said she knew how to count, that her father had taught her since she was 5, that she'd been keeping his ledgers since she was 12, that she knew the prices of everything from salt to whale blubber. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he asked if she wanted to work. Hana asked what the job was. Dan said trade manager for Soul Gear. Hana choked on her broth. She coughed it up. She looked at him. She asked if he was serious. Dan said he was absolutely serious, that he needed someone who could do the math better than he could, that Mira ran the ice house and the blacksmith shop, that Lena handled the internal accounting, but no one managed trade with the outside world. He did it himself and did it poorly. He needed a specialist. Hana stood there with the bowl in her hands. Then she straightened up. She wiped her chin. She said she'd take the job, but she had conditions. Dan asked what they were. Hana said she wanted to see all the supplies, everything, including his personal stash. Dan thought for a moment. Should he tell her about the cash? Show it to her? He looked at her. 19 years old, freezing, hungry. She'd just returned from a 10-day trek through the snow, and the first thing she did was haggle over the terms. He nodded, said he'd show her. Hana nodded, finished her broth, asked for seconds. Dan gave her some. Summer in the north lasted as long as a breath. 3 months of white nights. The sun never set. It hung over the horizon around the clock. Dull, cold by southern standards, but warm by Soul Gear standards. The snow had melted. The ground had thawed to a depth of half a meter. Deeper down lay the permafrost. Dan stood on the southern slope and looked at his garden beds. The turnips had sprouted. Green shoots poked out of the black soil in neat rows. The barley had broken through with thin shoots. The cabbage hadn't survived. Night frosts had killed the seedlings. Dan made a note. Shelf I-2. Agriculture. Cabbage isn't suitable. More frost-resistant varieties are needed. Turnips and barley are viable. He wasn't discouraged. 2 out of 3 is a good result for a first attempt. The village had grown even more over the summer. 20 more people had arrived from various places. Families, loners, and an old man who'd walked alone for a week because he'd heard they were feeding people in Soul Gear. A young couple with a baby. A hunter whose arm had been broken by a bear and who'd been abandoned in the woods by his own people. Solveig set his bone and applied a splint. Mira found a place for everyone. Hana included them in the head count. Lena jotted it down in her notebook. Population 155. Dan looked at that number and realized that Soul Gear was no longer a village. It was a settlement. A small fortress with a rampart, a blacksmith shop, warehouses, and a school. A school he had opened at the beginning of summer. The school was simple. 1 house, 1 teacher, Dan. He taught the children to count, to write, to read, to tie knots, to determine direction by the stars, to estimate distance by eye, to calculate supplies in man days. Lena was his assistant. She stood in front of the younger children and explained what a man day was with such seriousness that the adults stopped to listen. Within a month, the whole village was counting in man days. Bjorn used the term at every village meeting. Grim grumbled that in his day, they'd manage without such silly words. But he counted too. On the 180th day, Dan made a decision. He would go to the White Forest. Not to hunt, not to scout. Deep into the forest. To search for his father. Hravan said he sensed a gift in the forest. An old one. Fading. If it was his father, then he was alive. For now. But fading meant time was running out. Dan couldn't wait. He called a council meeting. Bjorn, Grim, Solveig, Mira, Hana, Eira, and Lena. He said he was leaving, that he didn't know for how long, that the village would be without him, but not without leadership. Bjorn is the village head. Mira manages the warehouses and the smithy. Hana handles trade. Lena keeps the accounts. Solveig heals. Grim hunts. The machine runs without him. He built it for that, so it would run without him. Bjorn said Dan shouldn't go alone. Dan said he wouldn't go alone. He looked at Eira. Eira nodded, without words, without questions. She just nodded, as if she'd been expecting this. Grim said he'd go too. Dan shook his head. He said Grim was needed here, that without him, the hunt would come to a standstill. Grim started to argue. Dan said it was an order. Grim snorted and said the kid was getting too bold, but he stayed. Mira said she'd give them supplies from the glacier. Dan said it wasn't necessary, that he had enough in storage to last 6 months, for the 2 of them. Mira looked at him and, for the first time ever, hugged him, tightly, like a mother. Dan stood in her arms and realized that this was the first hug he'd ever received in this world from an adult. Not from Lena, from an adult. Mira let him go and told him to come back. Dan said he would. Lena wasn't crying. She stood upright and looked at him. Her eyes were dry. Her face was serious. She said she'd keep track of everything while he was gone, that the warehouse would be fine, that she'd record every kilogram that came in and went out. Dan crouched down in front of her. He took something out of the storage area, A small cloth bundle. Inside was half a cinnamon roll. Warm, fragrant, the very same one from the first day. He handed it to Lena. He said it was his most important possession, from the place where he'd lived before he met her. He said that as long as it was with Lena, he would definitely come back, because he needed to take it back. Lena took the roll. She sniffed it. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. She tucked the bundle into her bosom. She nodded. On the 5th day of their journey, Era found footprints, barefoot, in a summer forest where snow lay only in the shade of old fir trees. The footprints led across the moss, deep, heavy, as if the person walking had been carrying a huge load. Era crouched down. She touched the moss. She said they were fresh. A few hours later, Dan looked at the tracks, bare feet, in summer, in a forest where even now the temperature hadn't risen above 10. His father had walked barefoot on the frozen ground for over a year. Dan clenched his teeth and followed the tracks. The tracks led deeper, deeper and deeper. The forest changed. The trees grew older, thicker, trunks 3 arm spans wide, bark covered in moss and lichen. Almost no light penetrated. The air felt different, not cold, not warm, non-existent, like in a perfectly insulated room. Dan recognized that feeling, stasis, just like in his warehouse, as if time had slowed down here. Era walked more slowly, more cautiously. Her hand never left her bow. She spoke even less than usual. 1 word an hour. That way. Stop. Quiet. On the 6th day, they found a clearing, round, flat, as if carved out of the forest. Trees stood around it like a wall. In the center of the clearing lay a rock, large, flat, gray. A man was sitting on the rock. Dan stopped. His heart pounded so hard it rang in his ears. The man on the rock was thin. No, not thin. Emaciated. A skeleton covered in skin. His hair was long, white, not gray, white as snow. His beard reached down to his waist. He was almost naked, just scraps of fabric on his hips. His feet were bare. His hands rested on his knees, palms up. His eyes were closed. He sat motionless, like a statue. Dan took a step, a second, a third. The man opened his eyes. His eyes were gray, like Lena's, exactly the same. Dan stopped. He stood there and stared. The man looked at him. Then he opened his mouth and said 1 word. Son. His name was Cole Solgear, Dan's father, a former hunter, the bearer of the 3rd shard. He had been sitting on that rock for 14 months, without food, without water, without sleep. The shard inside him kept him alive, barely, on the brink, a dying flame. Dan walked over to him and crouched down. He took some broth out of the storage compartment, hot, 60 degrees. He brought it to his lips. Cole drank slowly, sip by sip. His Adam's apple moved beneath his skin like a ball under fabric. He finished it. He looked at his son. Dan saw his eyes. There was pain in them, exhaustion, and something else, relief. Cole said quietly that he'd been waiting, that he knew someone would come, that the shard had told him. Cole began to tell his story, slowly, with pauses. His voice was hoarse, like a rusty mechanism. He told him about the shard, about how 1,000 years ago a god lived in the north. Not a god in the sense that people pray to, something ancient, older than the forest, older than the ice. It cared for the north, nourished the earth, maintained balance. Beasts, humans, and the forest coexisted because it upheld that balance. Then it shattered. Cole didn't know why. Maybe it grew tired. Maybe someone shattered it. The shards scattered across the world. They found their way into people, those who know how to care, those who aren't indifferent. Cole's shard came to him through his father, and to his father through his grandfather. A family gift, a repository, the ability to preserve, to keep things from disappearing. But there was another shard, a dark one. It found its way into a creature that knew nothing of care, one that knew only hunger. Tiki. Tiki wasn't evil. He was hungry. Endlessly. Hopelessly. He devoured. Beasts. Trees. People. Not because he wanted to kill, because he couldn't get enough. Because the shard inside him was damaged and didn't know how to preserve, only to take. And every year, quiet grew. And every year, the forest died a little more. The hungry decade is no accident. It's quiet. His hunger is devouring the north. Cole came here a year ago. He'd heard about Taki from his father. He knew that one of the bearers had to hold him back, to maintain the balance. Cole sat down on this rock and opened his shard. He created a barrier, not a wall, more like a net. His reservoir acted as an anchor. It kept Taki in place. It kept him from moving any closer to the villages. Every day, every minute, 14 months. Cole sat there and held him back, and with each passing day, his shard grew weaker. Because one shard can't hold another back forever. Because Cole was dying, slowly, piece by piece. Dan went on alone. Ira stayed with Cole. He'd asked her to. He'd said his father wouldn't make it on his own, that he needed someone by his side, someone to bring him broth and tell him everything would be all right. Ira looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. Before leaving, she did something he didn't expect. She walked over, took his hand, squeezed it. Hard. Her palm was small, stiff, and hot. She held his hand for 3 seconds. Then she let go and turned away. Dan left. The forest beyond the clearing was different, quieter, more lifeless. The trees stood there, but they had no leaves. The moss on the trunks had dried out and turned white. The ground beneath his feet was neither frozen nor warm. It was nothing. Like plastic. Like linoleum in a warehouse. Dan walked, and with every step, he felt the space around him changing, as if the forest were contracting. Not physically. It was a sensation. The air was getting denser. The silence was getting louder. A paradox. Silence isn't supposed to be loud, but here it was. It pressed against his ears. It filled his head. Like cotton wool. Like a noise made up of the absence of noise. He walked for 2 hours, maybe 3. Time didn't work normally here. He didn't have a watch. His sense of time had failed him. An hour might have passed. A day might have passed. Then the trees ended. They just ended. The last trunk and nothing beyond it. A flat, white plain. Not snow, not ice. Something else. Soft, quiet, white. Like paper, like a blank sheet of paper on which no one had written anything. Dan stood at the edge and looked out. The plain stretched to the horizon. Or maybe not to the horizon. There was no horizon here. White blended into white, earth into sky, air into silence. Everything was one. He stepped onto the plain. His foot sank ankle-deep into the softness. Not cold, not warm. He walked on. With every step, he felt a shard inside him vibrate, quietly, like a tuning fork. The repository in his head glowed. Shelves, racks, everything he had accumulated. Tons of meat, fish, hides, salt, stones, broth, notebooks, Lena's notes, Yuki's knowledge, songs of the forest people. No, He hadn't met Yuki yet. That would come later, or had already happened. Time didn't work here. He shook his head. He focused. He kept walking. He saw the Silent One an hour later, or a minute later. It was sitting on the white plain, not standing, not lying down. Sitting, like coal on a rock, only without the rock, just sitting on the white plain. Dan stopped. He watched. The Silent One wasn't a monster. It wasn't a beast. It wasn't a shadow. It was. Dan couldn't find the word. A form, a silhouette, the outline of something that had once been something, but had long since forgotten what. It had the contours of a body, of arms, of a head, but inside those contours there was nothing. Not darkness, not light, emptiness. That very emptiness Dan had seen in the eyes of the starving children of Soul Gear. That emptiness that appears when a person has gone so long without eating that they've stopped wanting to eat. When hunger passes through pain and emerges on the other side into nothingness. Dan stood and looked at the Silent One. The Silent One didn't move, didn't look. He had no eyes. But Dan felt the attention. Heavy, hungry, endlessly hungry. The Silent One was devouring, every second, everything around him. The white plain was all that remained after him. He had eaten the forest, devoured the earth, devoured color and sound and scent. All that remained was white nothingness. And he was still hungry. Dan didn't understand this with his mind. He felt it with a shard. The vault inside him resonated with the Silent One's emptiness, like two tuning forks on the same note. Only one was full and the other was empty. Dan sat down, right on the white, across from the Silent One, 3 meters away. He took a bowl out of the storage. He took out some hot broth. He poured it. He placed it between himself and the Silent One. The broth was steaming. In the white void, the steam rose in a steady column. The Silent One didn't move. Dan waited. A minute, 10 minutes, an hour. Tiki didn't move. Dan took out the meat, venison, still hot. He placed it next to the bowl. He took out the fish. He placed it there. He took out the bread he bought from a merchant 3 days ago and stored away. He placed it there. The food lay on the white plain, steaming, hot, fresh, alive, in a dead world. The Silent One stirred, barely noticeably. The outline of his hand moved. It reached for the bowl. Dan didn't step back. He wasn't afraid. The Silent One's hand touched the bowl. The bowl didn't disappear. It didn't dissolve. The Silent One touched it and froze, as if he'd forgotten what to do next, as if it had been so long since he'd received anything that he'd forgotten how to take it. Dan leaned down. He picked up the bowl. He brought it to the spot where Silent's face should have been. He tilted it. The broth flowed out, into the void, into nothingness. And the void accepted it. Dan saw how Silent's contours changed, just a little. For a split second, something flashed inside the void. Not a color, not a shape. Warmth. A sensation of warmth. Like the glint of a fire in a dark window. Dan began to feed him, methodically, like in a warehouse, item by item, shelf by shelf. He opened the storeroom and began to take things out. Meat, fish, bread, berries, grain, turnips, everything there was. He placed them in front of Tiki. He offered them to him. Tiki took them, slowly, hesitantly, like a child eating on his own for the first time. Every bite he took changed him. His contours grew firmer, sharper. Something emerged within him. Not flesh, not matter, a presence. He ceased to be a void. He became something. Dan fed him and kept count. 100 kilograms, 200, 500. He gave it all away. Shelf A, empty. Shelf B, empty. Shelf C, empty. Rack after rack. His storeroom was emptying. 1,800 kilograms of meat and fish, 300 kilograms of grain, salt, berries, everything. Dan returned to the clearing at dawn. He walked easily. The storage facility was empty. His body was heavy with fatigue, but inside it was quiet and clear. Like a warehouse after a general inventory, when every item is in its place and the system is working. Only now, the system wasn't his. It was bigger. 3 shards hummed inside him in a single low note. Not loud, constant. Like the hum of a running refrigerator in a Seattle warehouse. A familiar sound. Right. Ira saw him first. She stood up, she looked, then she walked over quickly. She grabbed him by the shoulders. She examined him, his hands, his face, his eyes. She made sure he was okay. She let go, she took a step back. She told him he was an idiot. Dan said he knew. Cole was sitting on a rock, but differently, not hunched over, not dying. Upright, eyes open, clear. He was looking at his son, and there was something on his face that Dan didn't recognize at first. Peace. Cole said he could feel it, that the barrier was no longer needed, that the Silent One had stopped. Dan nodded. He said the Silent One hadn't stopped. The Silent One had had his fill. Cole looked at him for a long time. Then he laughed, quietly, hoarsely, like a man who'd forgotten how to laugh and was trying again. The return trip took 4 days, slowly. Cole walked with difficulty. 14 months without movement. His muscles had atrophied. Dan supported him by the arm. Ira walked ahead and cleared the path. Dan fed his father from the storeroom, which was no longer empty. It was filling up again. Slowly. The shard was working. Berries from the bushes they passed, mushrooms that Ira found at the tree roots, water from the streams. Everything went into the storeroom. The storeroom was alive. It was breathing. It had changed. Dan could feel it. The shelves were different now, not endless, but deeper, more spacious, as if the connection with the other fragments had expanded it. The forest was changing every day. Dan could see it. Ada could see it. The birds. They hadn't been there when they first arrived. Now they were. Small gray birds hopping along the branches and chirping to one another. Tracks on the ground. Hare tracks. Fox tracks. Deer tracks. The animals were returning. Slowly. Cautiously. Like residents entering a house after renovations. Sniffing around. Looking around. Then staying. The white forest was ceasing to be white. It was turning green, gray, brown, alive. The silence no longer consumed them. Its crack had been patched. Not fully repaired, but patched. Enough for the hunger to recede. Enough for the forest to begin to breathe. On the 4th day, they reached the edge of the forest. Dan saw the village from the hill. Solgir. Smoke rising from the chimneys. People on the rampart. Vegetable patches on the southern slope. Green, even turnips. Barley sprouting. Smoke rising from the blacksmith shop. Children running between the houses. He stood and watched. Cole stood beside him, leaning on his son's shoulder. He looked at the village where he was born, and which he hadn't seen in over a year. Ada stood a little to the side and watched, too. Then she said one word. Home. They were spotted from the embankment. A cry went through the village. Dan was back. People ran toward the gate. Lena was the first to come running out. She ran down the path, screaming. Not words, just screaming. She reached him. She threw herself at Dan so hard he nearly fell over. She clung to him with both hands, pressed herself against him. Dan hugged her. She was warm, heavier than he remembered. She'd grown. In the days he'd been gone, she'd grown. Lena lifted her head. Her face was wet. Her eyes were huge. She reached into her bosom, pulled out a small package. Half a cinnamon roll. Warm, fragrant. She held it out to him. Dan took it. He looked at the roll, at his daughter. No, at his sister. At his Lena. Then he broke the roll in half. He gave one half to her. He put the other half back on the shelf. Shelf 0, Unit number 1, the beginning. Lena saw Cole. She froze. She stared. Cole stared at her, the daughter he'd left behind a year ago, a skeleton with a gray face. Now a little girl stood before him, healthy, rosy-cheeked, with a notebook in her hand and a piece of charcoal behind her ear. Cole dropped to his knees. Lena approached, slowly. Then she hugged him, quietly, without a cry. Cole hugged her and cried. Dan stood nearby and didn't interfere. The village accepted Cole without question. Bjorn shook his hand. Grim hugged him like a brother. Solveig examined him and cursed. Then she began to treat him. Mira fed him. Hana added him to the population register. 156. That evening, Dan organized a communal dinner, a big one, for the whole village. Around the communal hearth, the cauldron bubbled. The smell of hot meat with lingonberries and wild onions rose into the evening sky. People sat around it. They ate. They talked. They laughed. Dan sat there watching them, each and every one of them. Bjorn was eating and arguing with Grim about which beam was stronger. Grim waved him off and ate a second helping. Solveig was scolding a teenager who had scraped his knees again, while at the same time bandaging his scrape. Mira sat with 8 children around her, serving each of them another helping. She was eating, not last, along with everyone else. Dan saw this and nodded to himself. Hana sat next to the merchant who had arrived that day and was haggling over a shipment of iron with such fervor that the merchant turned pale. Tim sat next to Grim and ate in silence, intently, like someone who remembers what it's like when there's no food, and therefore appreciates it when there is. Ira sat next to Dan. She was eating venison with lingonberries, with the tart berries, the ones he'd kept in the storeroom especially for her. She ate and didn't leave. She didn't hide. She sat among the people, shoulder to shoulder. Lena sat between Dan and Cole. She swung her legs back and forth. She ate. She told her father about the human days. Cole listened with the expression of someone who doesn't understand a word but is happy. Dan stood up. He scanned the village. 156 people. The rampart, the smithy, the glacier, the school, the garden beds, the smokehouse that Bjorn had built while Dan was away, the well that Tim had dug with the boys, the path to Craigholm that they'd trodden over the summer. He wasn't seeing a village. He was seeing a system, a functioning one, a living one, a self-sufficient one, a system that would outlive him, that would keep working when he was gone, that would feed people even after he was gone. He walked up to the embankment. He stood facing west, toward the white forest. The forest on the horizon looked different. Not dark, not dead, just a forest. Green, alive, ordinary, quiet. Somewhere deep within it, it sat still and did not devour. Sated. For the first time in 1,000 years. Dan could sense it, a distant, faint hum. Not hungry. Calm. 3 shards sang a single note inside him. Steady. Warm. The forest would return. The beast would return. The hungry decade was over. Not because Dan had killed the monster, because he had fed it. Behind him, Lena called out to him. She said she'd done the math. They now had enough food in the warehouse to feed 156 people for 14 months. She'd written it down in her notebook. She showed it to him. The numbers were even, neat, no mistakes. Dan took the notebook. He looked at it. Then he looked at Lena. She was standing in front of him, 9 years old, a piece of charcoal behind her ear, the notebook in her hand, well-fed, healthy, alive. She said she had something else. She pulled a quarter of a cinnamon roll out of her pocket, the one he'd given her half an hour ago. She hadn't eaten it. She'd saved it. She held it out to him. She said seriously, "Brother, I won't ask for more anymore. I'll just take it." Dan looked at her. Then he laughed and cried at the same time, just like on the first day. Only on the first day, he'd cried out of despair. But now, it was for something for which he had no word in either language. Lena hugged him. He hugged her. Outside the window, beyond the rampart, beyond the forest, beyond the horizon, the first real summer sun of the year was setting. Golden. Warm. And for the first time in 10 years, it was quiet in the north. Truly quiet. Not the deathly silence of the white forest, the living silence of a world that had enough. Dan stood on the rampart of Solgear, the village that had become a fortress, the fortress that had become a home where no one would ever go to bed hungry again. He closed his eyes and opened the storeroom. Shelves, racks, blue light. On shelf number 0 lay a quarter of a cinnamon bun, warm, fragrant. He didn't put it away. Let it stay there, a reminder of a world where every child has a role like this, every day. He came here to make it that way here, too. And he did. The warehouse is open.